Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Mormon Stories podcast. I'm your host, John Dehlin. It is May 29th, 2023, and we are super excited to have in studio a legend of Mormon podcasting, none other than Bill Reel, host of Mormon Discussion podcast and of Mormonism Live podcast with Radio Free Mormon and a network of other Mormon-themed podcasts, but a friend and someone who has made a huge impact in the lives of so many for so many years. And we are just excited to have him finally in studio to kind of tell his story, maybe with a little more vulnerability than he's even shown in the past, but also with high quality video and audio, which we've never done before. Yeah. Hey, Bill.
How are you, my friend?
Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, gracious to both of you guys to invite us out to do this, and we're super excited to have this conversation.
Yeah. And if that weren't enough, we have his wife, Amanda Reel, here to provide color. Hey, Amanda.
How are you?
Thanks for joining us.
Equally legendary, Amanda.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks for joining us, Amanda. And of course, now you know that Margie is here running shotgun today. Hey, Margie.
Hey.
All right. So yeah, if most of you will know Bill Reel very well, but if you don't, just as a very quick recap, Bill Reel was a sitting bishop for the Mormon Church. He's a convert to the church. He became a bishop at what age? 29?
29.
And for some reason started listening to Mormon Stories podcast as a sitting bishop and reached out to me while he was a sitting bishop. He was the first sitting bishop that I ever ended up interviewing on Mormon Stories as a sitting bishop. We've interviewed a few since.
Yeah.
But eventually, when I ran afoul with the church and got excommunicated, Bill kind of started a podcast to kind of maybe take over what Mormon Stories was trying to do, which was to provide a balanced view of Mormonism. Yeah. He ran that podcast called Mormon Discussion for many years. Yeah. And then eventually he got in his own trouble with the church and was excommunicated. Yeah. And since has been carrying the podcasting torch in a few other ways. Yeah. So anyway, anything you want to say to begin before we jump into your story?
No. I'm just super excited that Amanda and I can be here, that you guys extended an invitation to come out and to do this. And then we've got the event tomorrow night, and it's so gracious of you to do that. And so we're super excited just to share parts of our story that, again, have been on 4 times, but there are significant parts of the story that maybe at a time when you interviewed me and I was believing that I was less likely to tell. And here we are, and maybe we can share those parts now and help people kind of put other pieces and parts together.
Beautiful. And we've envisioned for now 3 parts to this story, so just be prepared. Part 1 is going to be kind of his early years, what led him to join the church, all the way through the end of his time as a sitting Mormon bishop around age 34-ish.
Yeah.
That's going to be part 1. He starts his podcast as a sitting bishop, which is fascinating. Part 2 is going to be, so that's kind of the rise of, or the making of Bishop Bill Reel. Part 2 is going to be his deconstruction, what led him to start really doubting and questioning the church, and to the point of maybe becoming more of a critic and an activist that led to his excommunication. That's going to be part 2. And then part 3 is going to be reconstruction, the messiness of life and reconstruction, but also the beauty of reconstruction. Yeah. Those are the 3 parts we're envisioning.
I think everything will fall into that. It sounds good.
Yeah, so strap in. And then also, we just wanted to note, when we have, both members of a couple, sometimes we get mixed feedback. Sometimes the focus we decide is going to be on one of the 2. And then other times we really want to hear from both. And they're both valid ways of approaching, I think, a podcast. Today, we've all decided together that that the focus is going to be on Bill's story, but that Amanda is going to provide important context and input. But for those of you who are like, wait a minute, I want to hear equal sides from both, because of our just what we decided we want the focus to be for today, it's going to be more the former, focusing on Bill's story with Amanda providing input, than it is trying to to tell both their stories in equal measure. So we just wanted to let people know that up front. And Bill has said that he feels his most authentic if occasionally a swear word or two might sneak out. So just know that there may be a swear word or two here and there, and that's just Bill being Bill.
Love it. Perfect, my friend.
Is that all right, Amanda?
It's perfectly okay.
All right. Well, let's begin. So, Bill, I want to hear about, normally we say, tell us, where does your Mormon story begin? But you're a convert. So your story doesn't begin as a Mormon story, but let's hear about the most important parts of your upbringing that either lead to your desire to join the Mormon church or that become really important parts of your Mormon journey later on.
Totally. So if I go back in time a little bit, my mother and my father, just to give a little background on who they were. My mom, her dad lived in West Virginia. My grandmother, her mother, had 3 children by 3 different men. And she was very much in poverty. She never learned to drive. My grandmother, that is. She never learned to drive. She got government assistance, and that's how she took care of things and paid the bills. They always lived in a very impoverished home, renting all the time. And my grandmother wasn't really emotionally available for her children. She really struggled. She was a great grandmother, but as a parent, she really struggled. And my mother ended up in foster care for a portion of her life. And anytime I would try to go to my mom to get information about what her life was like, especially later on when I joined Mormonism and we're doing genealogy and I want to collect those family stories, my mom always refused to tell me them. She always avoided the question. She always stayed away from it. My dad comes from a family where his father was abusive. Whenever the kids were in trouble, they would go run underneath the bed, and my grandfather would chase them down with a broomstick. And he would reach underneath the bed with a broomstick and whap at them until they came out. And so it was sort of an abusive home. And he was a great provider. He always worked, but he also wasn't really present for his children. And my dad is one of 8 kids. My mom is one of 3, but again, they each had different fathers, and her father was never present. And so both of my parents were sort of destined to fail. But that's not what happened. When my mom and dad had me and my brother, I've got one brother, and we're 4 years apart, my parents somehow magically discarded the most atrocious of the unhealthy behavior that they inherited. And they really showed up as parents who not only provided very well for us, but they also cared for us. My mom took us on hikes and did lots of things with us. We were always busy doing something, and we felt loved. My brother and I both look back on our childhood, and we both deeply felt loved and cared for. Childhood was great. I lived on a dead-end street. I had a cousin, actually 2 cousins, who lived about 3 houses down from me. And then I had another cousin and some other kind of extended family that lived about 10 houses down from me. And there were other kids on the street, and they were the same age as me. And so we had a really good friend group, and we played all the time, went out and built forts, and in the winter built igloos and built bridges across streams. And we just had a really fun childhood. And my brother and I both look back, and we wouldn't change anything. Like, growing up was magical. But one of the things I didn't realize until I was older is that my parents were very emotionally unavailable. There wasn't really the tender love and care that you see in some families that they have. And but they were always present. They were always supportive in terms of making sure that we had activities and things to go to. As a student, I was. This sounds arrogant, but I'm a highly intelligent person. I've got a high IQ. And that sort of was my downfall, because I remember being in like 3rd grade or so, whatever grade they first start doing IQ test. And the kid next to me, Andy Walker, he's the smartest kid in our class. We all know it. And he's sitting right next to me, and he gets his paper back to take home of what his IQ score is. And I get mine. I look over at his, and his is like in the high 130s. And I look at mine, and mine says like 141 or something. And I realize, like, wait a minute, I'm as smart as this kid. And all through school, I didn't apply myself. I always knew I could get by not doing the work. And so I wouldn't do the homework, but then I would ace the midterm and I would ace the final. And so I'd end up with a C, and the teachers were always frustrated because I wouldn't do the assignments, but I was always smart enough to get by without having to do that. And so in school, I was not a great student at all, and I didn't have a good work ethic at all. My parents would go like, hey, we'll give you $500 if you get 2 A's this semester. And I just couldn't do it. Didn't want to put that much work in. Had tons of friends, really enjoyed my childhood. I come from a family where my mom's side of the family isn't really present. My uncle and my aunt on that side are sort of have some dysfunction that they weren't really part of our lives, weren't really able to be. And my dad was one of 8 children, and they were really close-knit. All 8 members live in the same city. They all hung out all the time, and they were really present in our lives, but they were blue-collar, working class, drinking heavily on the weekends. And as I love them, and they're good people, but there was a part of me that sensed that maybe I wouldn't be able to handle that sort of life without succumbing to the alcohol as an alcoholic. I should probably back up and say there were times in my life where my dad would go out drinking after work. He wouldn't notify my mother that he was coming home at a certain time. He would just show up at 8 o'clock. And my mom every night would cook dinner, and we'd sit around the dining room table and eat dinner, the 4 of us. And my dad sometimes would just go after work and go to the bar and go drinking. And he would come home at like 8 or 9 or 10, and he'd be half in the bag. And he was never abusive. He was never harsh. But my mom was very frustrated with him not showing up the way that she wanted her husband as a father to be there. And so there were times where my mom would call the police and wouldn't let my dad in the house. And I could see out the big picture window in our living room, the police out there talking to my father, and my mom inside being sort of frantic that my dad wasn't living up to his obligations as a father and as a husband. And you could see my dad, he'd knock on the window and he'd let me in, and my mom wouldn't. And eventually the police would talk him into having to go somewhere for the night. And then he would come back in the morning. My mom would let him in. He'd get ready for work.
Wow.
But my parents were hardworking. They never missed work. They were never sick. They showed up every day. My dad worked in the road paving business, and my mom was a nurse's aide. And by the time I'm 12 years old, my mom had gone back to nursing school to be an LPN, and my dad had worked himself up to be the foreman of the quarry. And they got to the point where we sort of moved out of poverty into being sort of middle class. And at that point, I'm essentially living on a nicer street. My parents, again, their income is kind of jumped up a little bit, and life started to change. And now I'm in high school. And I guess at this point, maybe to talk about sort of meeting Amanda, there's some crazy things that happened in my childhood.
Was there any religious instruction in your
Great
upbringing?
question.
Also siblings?
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So my mom was a Baptist growing up, but her childhood was so rough that she abandoned it sometime around 15, 16 years old. I have a brother. We're 4 years apart, but we grew up in a home where there's a Bible. My parents had a family Bible. Adam and Eve were scantily clad. So there were times just as a 12-year-old, I'd open it up just to see pictures of a half-naked Eve in the family Bible. But our parents never pulled that book once off the shelf and gave us any sort of religious instruction. That was certainly not part of what was going on in our home. We had no religion. I remember going to a funeral for the first time in our family and hearing this religious service celebrating the death of this person. Not the death per se, but their life as they lived. And it was the first time I'd encountered any sort of religion at all. Religion just wasn't part of our upbringing. My grandfather on my dad's side was an atheist. My mom had sort of abandoned organized religion, although in her head she had kind of held belief. My dad sort of believes in a supreme being, but neither one of them ever brought that into our home. It was never an outward thing. It was only inside their heads, if that makes sense.
I have a question about, so where did you grow up?
Sandusky, Ohio. Mm-hmm. So if you were to take the state of Ohio and put your finger right in the center of it and then go all the way as north as far as you could, right up to Lake Erie, we lived right there and spent a lot of our time on the water. going on boat rides, swimming in the lake, going to beaches, fishing for perch and walleye. The water being so close and such a big body of water was really a fun part of our childhood. We spent a lot of time camping on holidays. We'd go to Mohican Valley every summer, and we'd go canoeing down the river with extended family, all my aunts and uncles on my dad's side. We were really close. We'd family reunions every year, volleyball with the aunts and uncles. It was just, my brother and I both say we wouldn't take anything back about it. Our childhood was essentially flawless, and the only complaint was the parents not being emotionally available. But we didn't really figure that out till later, when you start to see your own flaws and you start to see how other people are raising their children and what your home was sort of missing.
And then I just have a quick question. Can we go back to the moment that you were describing, or the recurring moments of your dad coming home sometimes and being locked out? What age is this that you have memories of that?
I got to imagine I'm somewhere in the age of 8 or 9, and my brother's somewhere in the age of 4 or 5.
Okay. Can I ask you a question about that?
Anything.
Do you have any memory as a boy looking out and having your dad knocking on the window? Like, do you remember how you processed what was happening in those moments? I'm just curious if you created a story, if you were like very much thinking along the same lines of your mom, if your mom vocalized what was going on and that you kind of were on, or did you feel split as a child, feeling very much for both? Like, how did you process it?
All of those. My mom was explaining to us that she couldn't tolerate my dad's behavior. Me and my brother both clearly understood my dad was a good person. My dad was never abusive. He was never verbally abusive. He was never physically abusive. He was always loving. But we also recognized that he wasn't doing what my mom expected of him. You know, she had abandoned so much unhealthiness and really was an incredible mother. And she had partnered up with a good person who sort of fell into the habits of his own family. And she just wasn't going to tolerate it. She didn't want her kids to be raised with the same dysfunction that she was raised with. And so in those moments, I wasn't necessarily pitted against my dad. It wasn't mom against dad and I'm choosing one or the other. It was recognizing that dad's not doing his responsibility, and that drinking to the degree was, and not coming home or not even letting her know when he would come home, was disruptive to the kind of home my mom was trying to create. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks for that.
Amanda, are things coming up for you?
Only just that,
You probably don't even know this, really, do you?
just, surface level, but what you said about your mom, not going to put up with the abuse for her children. And just getting to love a different part of my mother-in-law that we won't get to discuss together.
Yeah, whatever happened to her when she was young, I don't even know it. I know she was in foster care. My mom was born in, I think, Columbus, Ohio. Born in Columbus, Ohio. Ends up in Sandusky, Ohio. But when she goes into foster care, her foster parents take her to California away from her mother. And she's in foster care for some amount of time. And we don't get any piece of the story. She absolutely was adamant. Anytime you asked her directly, she refused to give you that information. And she says, you don't want to know those parts of it. Just know that things weren't okay. And I could only imagine there was a significant amount of abuse that happened. Because why else wouldn't you tell the story? But my mom didn't bring any of that. My mom was stern. My mom was an advocate for people within her realm. She worked as, again, a nurse's aide and then became an LPN. My mom was an advocate for people who were marginalized in her workspace. She didn't tolerate medical faculty being abusive towards. She worked in a nursing home. I hate nursing homes to this day. I remember going in there to visit my mom with my dad, And there were people towards the end of life who were senile and they were making animal noises. There was one guy in particular who would moo like a cow or make crows like a rooster. And the place smelled like what nursing homes smell like. And I just remember being a little kid and going, I don't like this place. This place isn't where I want to be. But my mom treated those patients with deep respect. By the way, my wife worked with her for a significant amount of time in the same facility. And so my wife can speak to kind of who my mom was and how she operated. But my mom was an advocate for folks who couldn't defend themselves. I can only think that plays a role in kind of how I see the world and how I show up. Anyway. Where do you want to go from there?
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thanks, Amanda.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for sharing. That's beautiful. So, not a very religious home
At all. Zero.
Yeah. And some trauma, probably for both your parents.
Yeah.
So let's talk about how that played into your adolescence, I guess.
So I felt like childhood was great. I played sports. I was really good at baseball. I played in like Atom League is what they called it. I don't know what they call it around the world, but in Ohio it was called Atom League. And I was really good, but I was lackadaisical. I'm the kid in right field who's just kind of playing in the grass while the ball's hit right to him. But I had ability, and my dad got tired of coaches kind of favoring their kids. And so he pulled me off the team. And so I didn't play organized baseball for 3 or 4 years. And then when I was 12 years old, I went back to playing, and I was immediately put in as the cleanup hitter. Our team won the World Series. I made the All-Star team, which I thought was kind of a cool thing, that having stepped away and not played the sport, to jump right back in, it sort of validated that my dad was right, that the kid had ability and he could play. I played football. I was a starting linebacker the first year, and then I was a starting defensive tackle the second. But the last practice before the last game at 12 years old, I tore my ACL. And I had to have knee surgery. And then I tore my ACL again when I was 14 years old, left knee this time instead of the right knee. And then I tore my left knee again when I was 16 years old. And so sports were done. I ended up playing golf. I lettered in golf my senior year. But sports were just something that I deeply loved, but I couldn't quite play. And didn't apply myself in school, as we talked about. I sensed that my family, again, blue collar, a lot of alcohol, that I just wanted to get on a different track. I wanted to be the kind of dad that, again, no offense to my father, but that my mom did, that my mom somehow turned around her life and she wanted to show up being a good mom. And I knew that I was sort of sensing that I didn't have the tools to be a good dad or a good husband. And so, as we get into kind of Mormonism coming along, it really did offer at least a narrative that felt like would give me the tools that I could jump into being a good husband and a good father. Not that that's what happened, but that I thought it could. So I'm please.
So that connection, I'm just here, I want to be clear. So are you making the connection then that in your mind a little bit, you having the experience of your dad and not having that kind of dad in your life and experiencing that kind of dad, that as a teen, you kind of also, you felt a bit of a deficit?
Yeah.
In your own capacity maybe, or what you wanted to be even for a dad?
Yeah, my father was great, but he didn't connect. He didn't sit down and, hey, father, here's son, here's how the world works. There was never any of that. There was never any conversations one-on-one where he helped me understand how the world works. And I sensed that as I went into life that I sort of was going to have the same lack of ability to connect with my wife and children. And I sensed that I needed something to do that. And I remember, I look back, I remember early on, again, we'll get to the church, but early on in the church, talking about how this gave me the tools to be a good father and a good husband. I saw it as a gateway into being the thing that I somehow never got the training or the schooling to be.
So there's an idea maybe that comes into play later that your attraction to the Mormon church was that it might give you that extra something that you lacked.
The structure,
from
the
your
lessons,
parents.
yeah. It would give me the tools that I could then give my kids something better than what my dad was giving me. And I don't want people to get the wrong idea. He was kind. He wasn't abusive. It wasn't a matter of him being harmful to us. Anyway.
In your outline, you mentioned your use of substances in your early adolescence. Is that something that's worth noting for your Mormon journey?
Yeah, I wouldn't say I was a bad kid, but we were certainly getting into trouble. When I was 12 years old, I started drinking alcohol. My cousin, who his parents had gotten divorced, his mom had remarried, and she had remarried a Vietnam veteran, and they had moved to a different city, and I would go spend the night at my cousin's house. And as I got to be 12 years old, which seems like such a young age, my aunt made it safe for us to drink there. And her line of thinking was that if I drank there, if her son drank there, we wouldn't go out and find trouble elsewhere, and we could have supervision. And it was fun. We would go to her house, and we would sit and play card games, and she would get a case of Busch Light, and that's what we would drink. And
12 is kind of young.
It is, 12 years old. And again, I don't look at that negatively. I looked at that as a great moment in my growing up, and I wouldn't change it. Mm-hmm. By the time I'm 14 years old, I start using cannabis with all the kids in our neighborhood. The folks started, my cousin started using it. The kid down the street started using it. I felt a lot of pressure to do so, and I started using it, and I really enjoyed the experiences I was having with it. And by the time I'm 16 years old, I start selling drugs to kids in my school, and we would buy a large amount from one friend. We'd break it up into smaller amounts, and then we would sell it to other kids in my school system and my cousin's school system. And so I wasn't like a drug dealer, but for a short time, 2 or 3 months, kids would reach out, and we'd be the contact to get them marijuana.
So I'm thinking about my own friend group in high school, and I had some friends who discovered cannabis into high school. And for me, there was this sharp difference between how motivated they were prior to discovering marijuana and then how their grades, their involvement in extracurricular stuff just totally tanked once they really discovered marijuana and started to be a daily user. You talk about being an underachiever relative to your intellect. From your own story, do you see a correlation there, or am I just interjecting or imposing what I saw with my friend group onto you?
Yeah, not at all. I was a C student when I started, and I was a C student when I ended.
Okay.
We were doing things. I mean, that living a life that way, we were shoplifting. There was one time we went into a grocery store. We all wore trench coats, and I took a bottle of alcohol off the shelf and stuck it in my trench coat. And suddenly on the loudspeaker, it was like, we have a code 37 in aisle 14 or whatever. So I hurry up and put it back, and the whoever the person representing security for the grocery store stopped us on the way out and said, "Hey, we know you guys took alcohol." And we were cocky. We're like, "Go ahead and search us." And they searched us, and they didn't find anything. They let us go. We would often go into grocery stores and take like little Mike's Hard Lemonades or something and stuff them down our pants and walk out. But we didn't do like major crime. It was sort of just the fun of getting away with it. It didn't really affect my grades. Again, I never got worse than being a C student, and I never got better than being a C student. I had a 2.5 in high school. I went to Bowling Green State University for 3.5 years. I went to be an elementary teacher. My grades, I was cheating on tests at times in high school. I had a clear pen, and I would take off the back end of the cap, and I would write all the answers really small on a piece of paper and stick them down the clear tube of the pen. And then I would go into class, and I would have all the answers kind of written around. But I didn't need it for math, but I would use it in chemistry, for instance, where maybe I had a little more trouble catching on. Didn't want to remember as many things. I remember I took 2 years of Spanish. In my second year in Spanish, I had like a D- going into the final exam. And the teacher told me, she goes, "You're going to fail. You have not applied yourself, and you don't have what it takes to pass this class." And I said, "I'll show you." And there was a short little break, a 4-day break or something from school, a holiday of some sort, to come back and do the final exam. And for those 4 days, I went and applied myself. And I said, "I'll remember all this stuff." And ended up getting a C in the class. I ended up doing quite well in the final exam and got my grades up. Drugs never affected me on an education level. When I went to college, I had a 2.9. I went to Bowling Green State University, and to be a teacher, you had to have a 3.2 or be in the top 100 of the class. And I was not there. And when I sat down with the school counselors to figure out what to do, because now I need to do my student teaching and my methods classes, and they told me, said, your grades aren't high enough. You're going to have to transfer somewhere. This isn't going to work here. You can keep taking classes and try to get your 2.9 up to a 3.2, but it takes some real work once you've got most of your education behind you. And so I tried to transfer to another university, Ashland University, and they only required a 2.5, so I might have been the valedictorian there. But when I tried to transfer like 7 or 8 of my classes, 17 credits or something, wouldn't transfer over. And so now I'm turning a 4-year education into a 6-year education, except I'm not walking out a doctor or a lawyer. And Amanda, by that time I'm married, Amanda got pregnant, and I just needed to move on. And so I just ended up finding a job and dropped out of college.
Well, let's go back, and I'm assuming Amanda is your introduction to Mormonism. So do you want to briefly talk about meeting Amanda and then how that led to you joining the church? Yep.
So I'm working at a restaurant, Perkins Pancake House in Sandusky, Ohio. Minimum wage is $4.25, $4.75. I start off as a busboy. I bust my rear end. I become really good at it. I'm again, busboy, but whatever. I become the best busboy out of the 4 or 5 they've got there, and they promote me over to be the baker. They have 2 other women who are doing the baking for the company, but they need 1 more person. And so they offer me the job as the baker. They start paying me like $8 an hour when minimum wage is $4.75 and I'm in high school. And I feel like I've showed that I have a work ethic, that I'm always going to show up, I'm always going to work hard, and that was a ton of fun. I went to an outlet mall near our home, and when me and my best friend came out of that outlet mall, I'm pausing only because I'm thinking of something else that I'd want to share. But when I came out of the outlet mall, on our windshield wiper of his car was a paper about getting a second job at a fast food restaurant, McDonald's. And so I went and applied. I just wanted to work 2 jobs. I thought, let's just have more money. Let's work somewhere else and be good at it. I really wanted to start putting some money aside. And so I got a second job at McDonald's, and Amanda worked there. And we got to know each other, and she was a little flirty, and I got to talking to her. But all through school, I was constantly rejected by women, or perceived that I would be rejected by girls in my school. And so even when I liked a girl, I was scared to death to go ask her to go on a date or anything, because I felt like that's just going to be a chance to feel shame and rejection. And so Amanda, being as brave as she was, she reached out and actually called me. And her and I got into a conversation, and I asked her on a date. The moment she calls, I know she's interested. It makes it easy. I don't have to worry about being rejected. And so I asked her on a date, and we went to see Toy Story. We went to a nice restaurant called Buzz's Eating Experience. They had candles and everything there. It was such a good atmosphere. And we talked all through dinner. We went to the movie, and I didn't know it, but Amanda is a big fan of Disney. And she loves Disney movies, and she had been collecting them. And so taking her to Toy Story Part 1, I think was kind of the gateway into her really knowing that I was doing things that she liked. It was around Christmas time, and on the way home, we were going to drive by all the lights that the city had put downtown. And we had passed them all and didn't even realize it because we were engaged in such a good conversation. And it was this first time in my life where a female other than my mother's paying attention to me.
You're how old?
I am 17 years old. My birthday's in September, so I started school when I'm in kindergarten when I'm 4 instead of 5, like everybody else. My birthday essentially was 6 months later than everyone else. And so I'm sort of like the youngest kid in my grade at all times. So I'm like a 17-year-old in my senior year. Started my senior year as a 16-year-old. But it was the first time that a female paid attention to me, and that this person liked me and spent time with me. Yeah.
So Amanda, really quickly, give us just a quick overview of your Mormon story background, just so that we can make sure and know kind of what you're bringing to this relationship and what background.
Sure. So no pioneer stock. My mom's parents were the reorganized church. Missionaries knocked on their door. So they're like, no, we're part of your church. And they're like, well, no, you're not. And so then they got baptized LDS. And then my father, when he met my mother as seniors as well, that was all for them as well. And so he got converted. And so I was born in the covenant, but my dad was a convert and my mom's parents were converts.
Okay. And how would you describe your Mormon upbringing? Pretty traditional, non-traditional?
Pretty traditional. Yeah.
Was the church really important to you?
Yeah. So, I had the whole princess dreams that everybody did, that I had a real castle to go to, though. And
in the celestial kingdom?
In the celestial kingdom and the temple. And, but having a low self-esteem, I had not set my sights there because I didn't think I was ever good enough, and who was going to marry me and take me to the temple. So I was already thinking I was not going to be married in the temple. I wasn't good enough. Nobody was going to take me. And then this handsome fella comes along, and he is just Peter Mormon, and he was my savior. And so...
What do you mean Peter Mormon?
I don't know. I know there's Molly Mormon, and then there was
Peter Priesthood.
Peter Priesthood.
But he
that's
wasn't
the
a
one.
member yet.
Not yet, but as he started, at first I was like, oh, I am going to get a husband. Okay, this is going to work. But then, when he started coming to church and he was more Mormon than I ever was, I'm like, oh, okay, this is going to work out after all.
Okay. All right. So, Bill, tell us how you go from dating Amanda to joining the church.
Yeah. So her dad was a good missionary. He recognizes that his responsibility as a good Mormon is to help bring people in. And so he wrapped his arms around me and said, I'd love you to show interest in this church. Is there any chance you'd be willing to go? Is there any chance you'd want to give it a chance and take a look at it and see if it's something that would interest you? And so I go to church for the very first time, and I go to the young men's lesson. And in that room, in the young men's room, there's 3 chalkboards, and they had a lesson on the Godhead. And God the Father was put up on one chalkboard, and Jesus Christ on another, Holy Ghost on the third. And as they explained the Godhead, again, I had no religious upbringing. Most of the kids in my school were Catholic or Lutheran that were religious. And yet somehow as the Godhead is being explained as 3 separate beings, that makes really total sense to me. It felt almost as if I'd already known that. And as you start to dive into Mormonism and the missionaries are teaching you and they're challenging you to have spiritual experiences, I sort of understood that it's such a small jump to go, I must have known that from the pre-earth life. I must have known that the Godhead were separate, and it just resonated. And so I attributed that kind of early on as a spiritual experience. And then the missionaries are coming by and they're teaching me, and they're encouraging me to read the Book of Mormon. And I read the whole thing. I read all 531 pages prior to getting baptized.
Like at 17, age 17?
17 years old. I read the whole thing. Again, I was committed. It was my promise to myself that I'm going to read the whole thing, then I'll pray about it, and then I'll know if it's true. And so I read the whole thing, prayed about it, and I can only describe it as a mystical experience. I sort of, as Paul says, right, whether in the body or out of the body, I do not know. I looked up, I was sitting I was laying down on the couch. Amanda was kneeling down on the floor, and we were talking about the word of wisdom as I'm taking the discussions. And it made sense to me that I'm going to have to give up using cannabis with my friends, but coffee and tea didn't make any sense. And so I'm sort of arguing with Amanda about sweet tea, because my dad would make it all the time, and I really loved it. And it didn't make any sense that God needs you to not drink coffee and tea. And so as she's sort of telling me, like, that's what the church has to have us do to join it, and I'm sort of pushing back, and then I start talking to her about praying about the Book of Mormon. I have this experience where I look up at the top of our steps. I'm on the split level home. I'm in the middle level. I'm looking up at the top of the steps, and I sort of sense this idea that God is answering my question about praying about the Book of Mormon, and he's telling me, not in any literal voice, but I sort of understand in my head that the church is true, and the message I get is the church is true, all of it. And I remember oops, sorry. I remember as I'm looking at the top of the steps, I kind of sense that this is going to be my wife. These are going to be my children. And I sort of, in my head, picture these kids that I'm going to have. And I count this as a deep spiritual experience. I know Mormonism is true now. At the same time, though, I am deeply interested in knowing everything I can about this religion. So I'm at school, going to the school library and looking up things on Mormonism. And as you can imagine, the school library has very little. So I go to the city library and I go up to the second floor and I'm walking around their historical section and I'm looking up things on Joseph Smith. And they don't have a lot, but one of the books they do have is the Fawn Brody book, No Man Knows My History. And I'm not smart enough or informed enough at the moment to understand that it's not an autobiography. My first thought is, this is Joseph Smith's autobiography, No Man Knows My History. And I grabbed it off the shelf. I filled out the card in the back. Of course, this is before really the internet is big. And the Dewey Decimal System. Take the book home and I read No Man Knows My History by Fawn Brody. And that book was challenging. I read it and I realized that this was written by a critic. There are lots of things being brought up that the missionaries aren't telling me. There's lots of things being brought up that I'm not hearing as I'm going to church for a few weeks, as I'm taking the discussions. And I end up going to my in-laws, my mother-in-law, my father-in-law. And I say to them, I say, hey, I'm reading this book and this has got a lot of criticisms. And her dad pulls out the Tanner's book, Shadow or Reality. And he says, oh yeah, I've read all this stuff before. Here's the book. I keep this so that I can easily remember the temple ordinances because they're all in there. And I asked them some of the questions. I remember posing 2 or 3, and I don't remember what the questions were, but I remember posing 2 or 3 questions to them. And their response was, we don't know the answers to that. But we know the church is true, and we ask you to have faith. So I went to school the next day, and there was a teacher that she didn't respect me, but I respected her. She was a hardliner, but she was a good teacher. You could tell that she stood up for who she was, and she represented herself authentically. And I went to her after class, and I said, hey, you're not Mormon, but I'm investigating the Mormon church. And I don't know what to do. There's problems, and yet I feel like maybe it's true. I don't know what to do. And she basically said, follow your heart. And my heart said, join the church. And so I set the problems aside and committed myself to Amanda, to the Mormons, the missionaries, to the leaders of the ward, that I was going to get baptized. And so I did.
So I guess a common way that converts end up joining the Mormon church and other high demand religions is they fall in love. So you're reading the Book of Mormon cover to cover and you're reading No Man Knows My History. On the one hand, I get it. Well, let me just start by asking, did Amanda basically throw down and say, I'm only going to marry someone who joins the church and I'm only going to get married in the temple? Was there that sort of expectation set or not?
Not at all. Amanda seems to make it clear that she wasn't expecting to go to the temple anyway. All of her siblings were dating non-members. Some of them joined the church, but they were highly inactive. And, you can speak for yourself, but it feels as though that was not an expectation at all. And maybe me coming around sort of then gave her the expectation that she can finally kind of live in that space and be have an active Mormon family.
So that was driven by you, the level, because many people join the church not reading the full Book of Mormon, let alone No Man Knows My History.
That's what I'm noticing. I'm noticing kind of the way you were describing yourself as a younger teen, new teen, was kind of a kind of playfulness, a lot of some kind of more innocent trouble, but also kind of pushing some lines there, but kind of just very peer-oriented activities, not in school, kind of doing enough to get by. And then you have this, it feels like a shift, but I'm curious how you would describe it, because you read a very serious book.
Yeah.
Book of Mormon is a serious kind of, and then you pursue this very serious endeavor of religion, right? Taking the missionary discussions, and as a teen. So
and without Amanda demanding it.
That's right. And so I'm just curious to connect with you during this time. What happened between the time of this, in stores shoving those
Alcohol
hard
bottles or whatever.
lemonades in your pants to like reading the Book of Mormon and really taking this commitment kind of seriously?
Yeah. So while I wasn't reading school textbooks, I was a voracious reader. One of the things my mom always did was on a weekly or biweekly basis, she would take us to the city library and we would always take out 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 books at a time. And
Warms my heart.
so I read a ton of books growing up. Hatchet by Gary Paulson, Where the Red Fern Grows, The Little Prince,
Wow.
Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, all Newbery Award winners, right? I
Margie's
was
vibing. She's nodding.
Yeah.
Margie did a lot of that.
I was a voracious reader. I loved information. I loved learning. School was just too easy. I really loved Abraham Lincoln, read tons of books on him and understood some of the complexities of his life with his interest in the woman who was pursuing him and her pursuing his adversary as he's running for office, and a deep lover of history. And when I met Mormonism, I sensed that the history was interesting, and I wanted nothing more than to know all of it. And so from the moment I'm investigating the church, I want to know everything about Mormonism. And so I just start grabbing any book I can get my hands on and reading it. My mom instilled that in me. My mom sensed that I think that education, or at least information, was a gateway to a better life. Mm-hmm. And then you go to church, right? And everybody's wearing their suits and ties and their dresses, and they're all smiling. That's the blueprint I wanted. It looked like everybody had a happy, productive, healthy family. Mm-hmm. You don't know what's hiding behind those masks. But on the surface, it looks really beautiful.
Yeah.
And when I go to church, I'm walking away from a blue-collar world where people are often not exactly doing their best because they're engaged with heavy drinking on the weekends and not really invested as much as they could be in the lives of their children. And I go to church and I see all these families sit together. And I see the suits and ties and the dresses and the smiles, and I just think this is it. This is the easy way to transition from the life I was going to have to the one I would like to.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I'm also thinking about how you described your kind of childhood observation of your parents and how effortful, honestly, how effortful it must have been for them to kind of, with their upbringings and what they experienced, to create this newer blueprint, to kind of offer something a little step up from what they experienced, but also children can notice the effort, how hard, the work that it takes to even just make a living, to have put food on the table. And so it also makes sense to me why, coming from that and coming from a whole family culture around just that effort of what it takes to kind of, emerge from where we start, why it would be so alluring to walk into a ward, smiling faces, all that, because it looks so easeful in that moment, right? It looks just so accessible. It's right there. You can touch it.
Yeah. What makes everyone in that congregation look like it's working? And it's the gospel of Jesus Christ, right? And you're right. I sense that my mom and dad had exponentially improved upon what they were given. And here's this chance for me now to improve upon what they had given me. And it feels like it's destiny. It feels like the Lord intervened and now I'm being picked up and put down on a different track.
I get it. So And you've already kind of half answered the question I was going to ask, because we're going to read later some emails you sent me as a bishop.
I'm excited.
But you mentioned reading No Man Knows My History in your emails to me as a Mormon bishop in your late 20s, early 30s. And so I get that ultimately what you did is what a lot of people do, is they just put their questions on the shelf and they join emotionally and socially instead of intellectually, primarily. I think primarily it sounds like you converted. You had a social and an emotional conversion to Mormonism, right?
Yeah, what I would say to that is that it was both. So while I'm encountering the problems, I'm also actively looking for the answer. So I knew that my mother-in-law and father-in-law weren't going to be able to answer the questions. So the internet is just starting to come online, and I start to look for answers there. So I find a site called New Jerusalem, and it had a guy named Book of Mormon Answer Man. I never found out who that guy was, but he always went by the pseudonym. And I would start looking up questions, and I would start printing out answers. So I would, when I went to college, for instance, I just joined the church. I'm going to Bowling Green State University. They have a computer lab. You are allowed to be in that computer lab whenever you want to be, and there's nobody's limiting how much paper you can print. So rather than doing schoolwork, because I know I can wing it and I'll be fine, didn't end up being that, but I spent all my time in the computer lab looking up problems in Mormonism. And then I would just print. I would walk out every day with 100 sheets of paper printed off with answers. Then I would go home and I would sit and read this stuff. I would just digest what the apologist or people out there trying to give answers to the questions were saying. The other thing that happens is, as Mormonism tells you that its critics are picking on certain issues, the apologists pick sometimes, at least early on they picked the simple issues. The critics want to tell you that the Book of Mormon says that Jesus was born in Jerusalem. Well, that has a simple answer. Here that's a land of Jerusalem, which Bethlehem's part of. And so there's this constant conversation where Mormonism is redirecting you to think that the real criticisms are nonsense. It's this evangelical criticism of Mormonism. And so you start to sense, I had these 4 books that were Lie in Wait to Deceive, written by the Browns. And I read all 4 of those.
They lie in wait.
Yes. Yeah. And I read all 4 of those. And all 4 of those books take the Wesley Walters, Ed Decker, the Cowdery gentleman, and they make it sound like the critics are just picking on the little things that there are good answers for.
Like straw man, maybe?
Yeah. Think that they're not the real criticisms of Mormonism, but you sense that's what it is. And so you build this idea in your head that Mormonism has its critics. They are really unhealthy people who are picking on things that there are good answers for, and they're picking on the naive and the innocent.
Vulnerable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so I sensed that Mormonism had problems, but they weren't real problems, and that the apologetics would solve those problems.
Okay. And I'm glad you covered that. And I think that's an important piece of the puzzle. Just rewinding for a second to you reading No Man Knows My History. That's really serious, because that book, there's a reason why it's feared and hated, because it's saying Joseph Smith married over 30 women. It's saying he married 14-year-olds. It's saying he did polyandry, married other men's wives. It's really deconstructing the Book of Abraham. I mean, she's got it all in there. There's almost nothing Jeremy Runnels mentions in CES letter, or frankly that we've covered on Mormon Stories, that Fawn Brody in 45 didn't cover.
To the point where Richard Bushman Bushman covers it 2 decades later or 3 decades later and covers the same material.
5 decades later, maybe.
Yeah.
But or 6. But to the point is, that's a lot to overcome. Her calling out the Book of Abraham, the Book of Mormon as frauds, right? Joseph Smith as a charlatan and as a kind of as a sexual predator. So it's one thing to sort of have some questions that you kind of just, these benign things seem a little bit off, but I'll put them on a shelf, like Jerusalem and the Book of Abraham. But like Fawn Brody takes it to a 10. And so I would understand you kind of being able to put some of those other tracks on the shelf. But Fawn Brody, I guess one answer would be, your love for Amanda, your love for a better life, and your experience with your in-laws and in the Mormon chapel, just simply the emotional impact of that outweighed the problems that you read in No Man Knows But History. All I'm saying is that seems like a really high hurdle to overcome. But maybe I'm underestimating the power of emotion.
Yeah.
Oh, Amanda.
Can I just really quick, and of course he needs to speak to this, but he loved the church. Like, I don't know how, I didn't read the book, so I don't know how he overcame and put that away or anything. So that might be interesting for you to speak to. But no, it's 100% genuinely him, all him, with no outsiders pressuring him. And he was really the best damn Mormon anybody would have wanted to have, solely on his own. Loved it.
I think two other things happened. One is that our brains have a way of dismissing, right? Cognitive dissonance forces you to choose one or the other or live with cognitive dissonance. And so cognitive dissonance had me going, look, I've had spiritual experiences. The second thing is that most of the criticisms I'm encountering are insignificant. It really does feel like Wesley Walters is falsely attacking the church and picking on things that aren't big deals. And so I sensed that maybe Fawn Brody was just more of the same and that I didn't need to take it uber seriously. Mm-hmm. And so I think the cognitive dissonance, I think the spiritual experiences, and I think noticing other anti-Mormon propaganda that the church wants you to sense while not wanting you to sense the real issues probably led to me being able to sort of just dismiss it out of hand.
Okay.
And I think it's important to say there is no just in emotion. Like, I'm thinking of the work of Jonathan Haidt.
Yeah.
Like, there is no just about that.
It's the elephant.
Especially
right?
if we look at like what Mormonism promises.
Yeah.
I mean, come on. Mm-hmm. And at stage of life where you are, and I love that you brought up the reading aspect of you growing up, because I see a seeker in that too, which goes very well with this too. So
that's
anyway.
a good point. Like, I remember an interview with Gordon B. Hinckley where he's called on some of the really harder history stuff, and he calls them flecks or flicks of history.
Yeah.
And I guess regardless of what you read in a book, if you're experiencing the power of Mormonism in a Mormon paradigm, in a Mormon ward, in a Mormon family, I guess everything else kind of pales in comparison, right?
Yeah. The other thing that happens too is that the moment I joined the church, I am immediately made the assistant ward mission leader. That's my first calling. And I'm working with the missionaries who taught me. And I'm working with an older gentleman who I served with all my time in the church. He was actually a counselor when I was bishop later on. He was my first counselor. I went from being the assistant ward mission leader to the secretary in the elders quorum, to second counselor in the elders quorum, to first counselor in the elders quorum, to first counselor in the young men's presidency, to counselor in the bishopric, to bishop, with no gap in between that. It was one onto the other, the other. Because as Amanda pointed out, I showed up. When people moved, I was the one who was there. Obviously, others were too, but I didn't miss anything. When there was a storehouse assignment, I'm there. They're home teaching, I want to go. Like, I'm the guy in the ward who, even as he just joins the church, knows the history as well as anyone else in that building, and who wants to be, I want to be the best Mormon. I want to knock it out of the park.
Makes sense. Really quickly, anything noteworthy about your temple, either your endowment or your marriage, that you want to just touch on?
So temple marriage. So I'm 19 years old. My father and mother-in-law take us to the temple. We stay the night before. We're going to get our endowment one day and we're going to get sealed the next. So the day we get our endowment, I go to the temple. I put on the temple garb as we all did. I've got the hat on. I've got the string tied. I've got the outfit with the sash. I'm slipping the slippers off, putting them back on. I looked around the room and I just sensed, first off, I go to the washing and anointing and they put the shield on you. And that didn't bother me highly, but I remember it as they're reaching underneath the shield and they're touching my body with oil and with water. I thought of like, hey, they gave me this temple prep class, and I still could not have guessed that this was the things that were going to happen. Mm-hmm. And then I go into the endowment and I'm in the full garb and I look around and the thought enters my head that I look and these people look like we're at a baker's convention. And it just looks weird. And there was something awkward about it. So we get done with the endowment. We go back to the hotel. I sleep in a bed with my father-in-law. My fiance sleeps in a bed with her mom. We get up the next day. We do the sealing thing. And the sealing was fine. Looking back, it's once you deconstruct and you're out, you sort of get shortchanged on this wedding experience. The other thing that happens is my mom can't go. And at the time, I'm trying to explain it to her. Mom, there's the Levites and there's the Ark of the Covenant, and the Levites can hold it, but no one else can. And if someone tries to steady it, you see what happened. Because I knew my mom sort of accepted the Bible. Again, we didn't have religion in her home, but I did know that she, as I'm investigating Mormonism, she's informing me that she had left the Baptist religion when she was a teenager and that she still believed the Bible. And so I'm trying to use a Bible story to convince her why she can't go. But this woman had 2 kids. She had planned her whole life to go to their wedding. It hurt. It stung. Stung to the point where we had a ring-bearing ceremony a few weeks later, and she didn't come. My dad stayed for a short minute, and as soon as this ring-bearing ceremony went to the reception and we started doing like the dollar dance and stuff, my dad got up and left. They were hurt. I didn't have a way. There's no way to explain that. You think as a believer you have some good way to explain, like, I'm really sorry, but this is how God works. Right? My mom held a grudge for years. She wouldn't even interact with us until my wife had our first child. And now she realized that she either had to put this grudge behind her or she wasn't going to have a relationship with her grandchildren. Mm-hmm. And so she finally made amends and moved past it. But to this day, my mom, when you join the church and your parents can't go to your temple wedding when your mother had been planning all her life to be part of that, when she had turned around her life so that she could see her kids succeed and not be able to be part of this event that she had anticipated her entire adulthood leading up to that moment, she was pissed at Mormonism. She was angry. She did not comprehend how this thing could take that from her. And now on this end of things, looking back, she was right. That was atrocious. Mm-hmm. If I could do it over again, there'd be no doubt. I'd get married in a civil marriage, and if the sealing happened later, so be it.
I'm sorry that happened.
Yeah.
It's a loss.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you were in it. So that's just unfortunate collateral.
It's collateral damage.
Yeah. To follow it. No, that's like sacrifice for seeking the truth. It's like, oh, we do hard things in Mormonism. And sorry, Mom, I found the truth, Yeah.
When you live the gospel of Jesus Christ, you're going to have challenges. You're going to have things thrown at you, and this is how you prove yourself.
And the weird thing is, while your mom's being hurt and offended and damaged, it's reinforcing your faith. It's like, I made sacrifices for the Lord,
Yeah, totally. And it was always that way. Like, I think we were always making sacrifices. We were full tithe payers, and we barely got by. Our first house we paid $45,000 for. It was 1,000 square foot, 3-bedroom, 1 bath, no dining room, living room and kitchen. We ate just cheap meals every night. Like we would. The one thing Amanda and I were communicating over was how to make ends meet. And we would plan on, okay, we'll order a pizza Friday to sort of celebrate having gotten through the week. But we had fried bologna sandwiches the night before and hot dogs the day before that and tuna noodle casserole the day before that. It was always these easy, cheap meals. And we were adamant, let's pay our tithing, let's get our blessings. But what it did was it left us always scratching and clawing, trying to make it work. Every week was a battle to stay in front of being in debt. No credit cards. We did what the church said. At the time, you think that's blessings. We're making it. It's working. One way or another, we always pay our bills. We always stay just ahead of it.
I mean, from the church's weirdly, social scientists have studied religions, and the more you would think, the easier a religion was on its people, the more committed they'd be because the religion wasn't so demanding. But it turns out the opposite is true. The more demanding a religion is, the more committed the members are. So you're talking about all those sacrifices you're making, paying all this money to the church while you're poor and barely getting the nutrition you need and barely making your payments. But the truth is that's strengthening your commitment to the church.
And it's added to by other things. The leaders of this church aren't paid, right? Until later on when you figure out they are. And
well, just the ones on top.
And the money goes to good use. The money is paying for the functions at the local ward. The money is going to humanitarian aid. The money is going to build the kingdom. You don't know that it's not. And so as long as your church looks like it is righteous and building the kingdom of God, then your sacrifice is part of that work.
It's a great work.
It's all reinforcing.
Yeah. I was wanting to connect just for a second if we were going to get just a snapshot of what you believed about marriage, like what you expected, what you kind of went into marriage.
Why is Amanda smiling?
Kind of thinking and believing, and you can add, if you want, like sexuality and intimacy, what your picture of that.
And gender roles.
And yeah, all that, like just a snapshot of like at this stage, you're newly, what did that look like?
I picked up on really quickly this idea that the man presides, that he leads the home, and that there's a degree of obedience expected from everyone behind him. And again, I come from a growing up where I didn't feel important, where I was constantly feeling rejected or the fear of rejection. I didn't feel like I was ever leading anything. And so to join the church and to suddenly someone to go, you're the leader, you lead, you be out front. And then you go to the temple. And I remember that she promised to be obedient to me as I was obedient to God. And so I went home and I started to expect her to get in line and follow the decisions I was making for our family. And so if what do you want to do tonight for dinner? It started with little things, but it soon becomes bigger things. This is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to do it. To the point where I'm breaking her heart and she's crying and there were times where she would just go into our room and just cry because I was so hard on her. And there was a moment where her dad comes over. She finally said, that's it, I'm out of here, I'm leaving. And she went down the street to go visit her mom and dad. And her dad comes back a short time later and he lays the scriptures out and he reads the D&C. For when men get a little bit of power, they begin to exercise unrighteous dominion. He was trying to put me in my place because he sensed too that the way I'm running this home is not appropriate. So I lightened up, but I didn't fix it.
So Amanda, were you torn seeing how faithful he was, but then how that maybe didn't always bring out his most kindest self? Well, how do you want to add to what Bill just shared about how you experience the patriarchy, basically?
Gosh, that's kind of really hard because I was totally in on that messaging that, your husband is faithful and he's not going to lead your household astray and everything's going to be okay. So I was good with giving him that power. He has our best interest at heart, and he's going to lead us the way he's supposed to and all the things. And so...
And just for those who've never been Mormon, I just want to add, as Bill said, when you covenanted in the temple, when you got married in the temple, the woman would covenant to hearken unto her husband, and the husband would covenant to obey God. So the woman's relationship with God in a classic Mormon sense, the woman's relationship with God literally is through the husband. And so when you talk about you being down for it, that was the contract.
Yeah.
Your contract was with your husband, and his contract was with God. Am I
Correct?
Is that right?
Yes.
Okay.
So much so.
Okay.
Yeah, and so the times he's speaking to, or I'm just crying in our room or whatever.
Like, what are these issues that you guys are having? Like, is it
Always money, right? When you don't have money, you fight about money.
The one I remember,
Yeah.
there's this moment we couldn't have anything, and I'm always got my thumb down on her. So there's times where she just tries to kind of expand and be herself and do something without having to ask me or get permission. And there's this moment in time where she buys some cookware. And the cookware was, in my mind, super expensive. It was $70 for a high-end frying pan or something. And I just remember coming home and being like, are you serious? Like, this is ridiculous. Like, you just went out and spent $70 when we're scrapping by trying to find food and to be able to eat and to get by, and we got to pay our tithing and, collect fast offerings next week. And as you point out, John, this whole idea of like hearkening to your husband as he hearkens unto God, she could see I was hearkening unto God. I was doing that part. I'm a damn good Mormon. But I think Mormonism gives you the ability to hide unhealthy behavior behind checked boxes. And so you can check boxes and say, I'm a good Mormon. I did my home teaching. I show up at every service project. I teach lessons. I'm happy to give a talk. I accept callings and I magnify them. Meanwhile, your ego is out of control and you are being abusive to your wife and kids, and you don't have anybody coming to you really to say, hey, that's not Christ-like. Instead, you go to church every week for 3 hours, and it's constantly reinforced that you're the good Mormon. You're the guy in our ward who does all the things you're asked to do.
Mm-hmm. Ironically, like there is no checkbox for like respect,
no
kindness
to your spouse.
No checkbox,
No.
for that.
Do you want to? So keep going, Amanda.
Well, I'm kind of bubbling and feeling like we need to kind of change gears a little bit to give you just kind of a little bit where I come from. Because I find it really funny that he talks about not having emotionally connected parents. And it's really funny because here I am also of 8 children, and I'm a Mormon, but we're not this lovey, touchy family. So I can probably guess my dad's love language is touch. My mom's is not. She doesn't like touch. She doesn't like cliquey women. She doesn't like cackly women. And so she doesn't do well in church because it's all cliquey and she doesn't like that. So it's really funny. Like I always knew my parents loved each other, and my dad would, this is how you kiss kids, and give her the whole big soap opera kiss and whatever. So the lack of touch, there wasn't a lack of affection. But so then when I see, Bill's family, getting to know them, they were always the hugs and I love yous before hanging up the phone or leaving.
Kiss your mom and dad on the face, yeah.
Yeah, and so they were kissy, lovey, touchy people. And so that was like, oh, I'm going to get this thing that I always wanted. Like, I always felt like I got the attention I ever wanted and needed. Like, I was a go-getter for those things. So, my mom's not a touch me not, but I'm 9 months pregnant with my first child, curled up in her lap and things like this. So always, those needs I felt taken care of. But looking at my husband's, family, I'm like, oh, he is connected to his family, because I didn't have extended family because my mom's brothers are complete jerks. And, and then my dad's side of the family, you just sat on the couch and you didn't move a muscle and you sat quiet while grown-ups talked. And, so it's really funny. You have this dream family, and just to hear you talk about the disconnect, that's kind of interesting. Yeah. So anyways, back on topic now. I don't know. It's just the thing for me. And even though we're crying, it's just, it's just normal family things. You know that no marriage or two people can ever come together perfectly in harmony, right? That just doesn't exist. So it's just, I don't know, just normal things that we go through as a couple, and we always find the other side.
But this idea of you feeling so desperate that you wanted to leave Bill, and your father needing to intervene to read Bill the the passages in the Doctrine and Covenants about unrighteous dominion. Like, it's not Mormon for a wife to leave her husband. So you must have been pushed to a breaking point, I'm guessing.
Yeah, that's funny. That just kind of made me realize, I guess that's kind of maybe the first start of how we did life. It seems that when things I feel are too big for me to handle anymore and I don't feel heard, like it's like, okay, I have to go. This isn't going to work. I have to go. And so there's been several times through our marriage where I didn't feel heard and I would have to flee. So, it would get so much and you're a volcano and there. So I guess that was my first episode of knowing how I resolution conflict. But again, like, I don't think I do the whole normal Mormon woman thing because I was never good enough for it. So maybe not exactly knowing how a Mormon woman should exactly handle things and things like that, because that wasn't going to be my life.
And so was there an assumption sometimes in the marriage then that you deserved it, that it was your failing, that the default would be, yeah, so this is how it goes because I'm the one that's not good enough?
Yeah, probably. Like, I am just lucky enough to have what I have, so I better find a way to get back in line and toe the line, so I don't lose all the things that I have that I never thought I was going to have. Right. So I better get back into line.
And it took her crying uncontrollably, or it took her leaving the house for me to realize that in that moment I had gone too far. And we weren't good communicators. We weren't working out problems. We were ships passing in the night. We were, you used the term, Margie, of parallel lives. It was that. Like, she took care of the house. I'd go to work. We'd come home. We'd eat dinner. We'd go to bed. We'd get up the next day and we'd do it again. And there wasn't sit down and like, hey, these are the conflicts in our life. These are the problems we need to solve. This is what's going on at work. Here's what's going on at home. How do you think we should handle? How do you think we should? Like, there was none of that.
Yeah.
There was almost no communication at all. Our love life was good. You said something about in terms of sexuality. Our sexuality, we were having a healthy sexuality. We were intimate. We were enjoying the romantic part of a relationship with each other. We had plenty of intimacy, but in the day-to-day handling of life, we just did our own thing and hardly ever connected up. And so when something irritated me, and I was almost always this feeling of resentment inside that even after I joined Mormonism, it didn't quite fill the void of like, I want to be my humanity and I can't. And so on some level, I'm resenting like that I left that life and that wasn't fulfilling. And now I've joined Mormonism and I'm killing it and I'm still not happy. And so if I'm not happy, then dang it, like, you guys all have to pay the price too. So I was hard on my kids and I'm hard on my wife. And it just feels like I am trying to feel safe and secure in my own internal world, and trying to control the outer world is exactly how I'm going about accomplishing it. And it would take me going too far and seeing the repercussions of that, where Amanda's hurt or my kids are deeply hurt, for me to go like, oh, like, you messed up. That was not okay. And at that point, then I would go and fix it. So her leaving was, or crying uncontrollably, is the only solution she had to get something to change or me to back off in that instance.
It's almost like to be seen, to have her humanity kind of show up outside the role. Because I think this is part of the role kind of structure, is when it's very transactional, right? It's kind of like, well, these are your responsibilities and here are mine, and it's about the boxes. And so it sounds like that, for whatever reason, was able to kind of penetrate some of the role, I don't know, shielding or whatever disconnect, and to have you, Bill, be able to kind of feel and see her for a minute.
the other thing too is I'm working at, so I drop out of college because my wife is pregnant. We're living in an apartment. The roof is leaking. The property management company won't fix the property. So here I am. I'm about to be a dad, and the world is dropping the ball, and my kid's going to come into an unhealthy environment. So I quit where I was working. I drop out of college, and I take a job that pays a little bit better, that looks like it can sort of be a career. And so I take a job with a floor covering company. And again, the way my brain works, I'm smart, but if the job doesn't require me to be on in that moment, I will essentially not apply myself. And so I would go to work, and the job I worked at was super easy. I would go out and measure rooms for carpeting, right? 12 by 12 room, come pick in a piece of carpet, no big deal. But in that job, 1 out of every 15, 1 out of every 20 measures, you had to pick out the details that you don't need to see in every other time. And so I would go out and measure a house, and I would miss these things that would be costly to our company. And so I was constantly living in fear of being fired or let go. I remember I made a big mistake one time, and my boss came to me and he goes, "Hey, no biggie. Everybody makes mistakes, but don't ever frickin' do it again, you know?" And I learned like, oh, if I make a mistake of that magnitude, I don't get to work here anymore. And because I dropped out of college, how am I going to put food on the table?
Yeah.
And then I run into where there's a guy at work, older guy. He was in his 50s when I start. And for whatever reason, he just doesn't like me. And so I already feel like I'm inadequate at this job, and it's really close to being fired or not. And this guy would, when phone messages would come in for me, he would take them and hide them under things on my desk, or he'd bump into my chair on purpose. And I didn't want to go to my boss and complain because I'm the weak link here. Are they going to get rid of the guy who's been here for 30 years, or are they going to get rid of me who's not exactly doing great anyway? And so feeling the shame of being unsuccessful professionally, my home in Mormonism was the only place where I could be in charge and feel good about myself. And Mormonism gives you permission to, as a male, to be in charge. There are lots of factors that play into why people bully in some places when they're being bullied in others. And unfortunately, I think as an adult, I was living out what never showed up as a child. As a kid in school, I got along with most everyone, and I was happy just to be there and to make jokes and to have fun and enjoy my friends.
It sounds like to some degree Mormonism worked for you because it had super high expectations. And it sounds like you liked to rise to high expectations, but if you weren't given high expectations, you wouldn't maybe rise as high.
Yeah.
So in that context, let's talk about how you became a bishop. Like I never became a bishop, and I felt like I was very committed to the church. I was in the church 45 years, and I never got called as a bishop. So, and that's in my 30s and 40s. How did you become called as a Mormon bishop at age 29?
Yeah. So the ward I joined when I was 17, as I said before, I just moved right up through leadership. It's a ward in the Midwest. It's Sandusky, Ohio. We would range somewhere between 110 people showing up on Sunday to, at real peak moments where everything was going well, maybe 140, but almost always between 110 and 120 folks. And so it was a ward that covered 11 cities and 3 counties. And the stake center was an hour away. And so everybody who showed up for church wanted to be there. But there were various degrees of activity. And I think what happened was there's only so many families in a ward in the Midwest who can carry the load of the ward. I think even in Utah, you say like there's these 10 families, and they kind of run things from year to year, and they move around in callings, but it's always those same 10. It was certainly that way in the Midwest. There was 5 or 6 families that were part of everything, and 3 of the men had already been the bishop. There's not a lot of options. I was serving in the bishopric, and the other thing too, I got to probably tell a story because it connects to it. We had bought our second home. Our 4th child was born, Zachary, and we realized our house was no longer going to be the size we could be comfortable in now that we've added this fourth child. And so we started looking for another home, and our real estate agent said, hey, if you actually go ahead and buy the second home and go ahead and empty out your cluttered home that you've stuffed 6 of you into this 1,000 square feet, then people coming to see the home would see the home is more likely to fit their needs and to buy it. So I took her advice, and we went ahead and bought our second house. And it was a 3-bedroom, 2-bath. It had a dining room, a little more space. And it was going to suit our needs better, bath and a half. And but in the meantime, our first house didn't sell, and so I ended up going to get a second job at the country club. I ran the front desk at the hotel of the country club at night, and so for about 4 months, I would get up at 8:30 in the morning. I had to be at my first job at Young's Floor Covering. I'd work there until 5:30 or 6. I'd go home, catch dinner. My wife would often go to work. She worked a part-time job at the nursing home. So she and I would visit for an hour or two. Then she would go off to work. Then I would help the kids get settled into bed. I would go to sleep at, say, 9 o'clock. Then I would get up at 11, and I'd have to be at my second job by midnight. And then I would work till 8 in the morning. I would drive to McDonald's. I'd grab a breakfast. And then I would go to my 8:30 job. And I did this for months on end. And whenever I could get 8 hours of sleep, great. But most of the week, I was working on 2 hours sleep a day. And it got to the point where I thought I was hiding it well enough from my first job. And I had a really close friend at that job. Her name was Julie. She'd been there about 5 years longer than I had been there. And she came up to me, took me aside and said, "Can I talk to you?" She goes, "I think something's wrong. Is everything okay in your world?" I said, "Why do you say that?" She goes, they're talking as if your work productivity has dropped off significantly and that things aren't going well in terms of how they feel about what you're doing. And I said, "To be honest, I'm working a second job and I'm just trying to make ends meet. I'm trying to pay 2 mortgages while putting myself and my family in a position to be able to have food on the table and have a roof over their heads and not lose the second house we just bought." And she says, "You might want to tell them that because they're talking about letting you go." And so I went in and told them, and they ended up giving me a little raise, and I was in the first house sold, and I was able to kind of move on from that. But there were months on end where I was trying to just make it work. And so again, I forget the original question, John, but
Well, it was about becoming bishop, but that was an important part.
So I think the leaders, our bishop that was in place, I was his second counselor. And so I'm serving in the bishopric. I'm missing meetings because I'm also working on Saturday night, Sunday morning. So I come to bishopric late. And they can see the sacrifice I'm making. But again, I'm the guy who always shows up to everything. So as they're getting ready to let this bishop go because he served his 5 years, the stake and the local leader, the bishop, sensed like the sacrifices I'd been making. And again, most of the men in this ward had that were active and showed up every week. Several of them had already served as the bishop. And so you had a pool of maybe 4 or 5 guys that could be the next bishop. And maybe 2 or 3 of them really were folks who were consistent in how they showed up in the church. And so I remember them sitting down as after a ward conference and talking to the bishopric after ward conference and asking the 3 of us how we felt about things. And I don't know what it was, but whatever happened, the way I answered the question or something, I could just see the look in their eye. There was something there. And I remember coming home and telling Amanda that, and I felt like it was a spiritual prompting, that I kind of sensed that I would be the next bishop. And you always hear these stories. And sometimes that person does, and sometimes they have to deal with the feelings of not being picked. I didn't tell anybody or do anything. I just told you. And I said, I think I'm going to be the next bishop. And suddenly about 2 or 3 weeks later, the executive secretary for the stake called up and said, "Hey, would you and your wife mind coming into the stake center stake president would like to sit down and talk to you. And I told her, I said that they've called. I think this is it. I think I'm the bishop. And we went to the meeting, and they sat down with me and extended the calling. And I was ready. I already knew, like, this is the Lord had brought me into the church and prepared me for this moment to serve as the bishop of the same ward that I had joined. These folks who had loved me in the gospel, now I had a chance to serve them and to love them back in a way that was a leader of them when they had been leaders of me, and kind of modeling what church service looked like up to that point.
But as I hear how difficult things were financially for both of you, like, it would seem what would be most normal would be you get called as bishop and you say, I can't. Like, no, I'm working 2 jobs. We're barely making ends meet. We've got all these kids. I'm not treating my wife as good as I want to.
Yeah.
No way in heck am I going to now take on the equivalent of the responsibility that a Catholic priest or a evangelical minister takes unpaid. Like, you would think the answer would be no, you know?
The church was the one thing I was good at.
Yeah.
Why wouldn't I?
I so see that. It was like the stable, particularly as you're like talking about all the things that are like out of your control, how much you were trying to just survive. Talk about effortful, you know? It makes sense because it's the sure thing. It's the thing that comes up and continually is telling you, good job. We reward you for that. Here's the reward for that. You're loved. We're going to shine a light on you, you know?
Mormonism might have been the only thing I was good at. I was not happy with how I was as a father. I had carried my parents' emotional unavailability into my own relationships. I didn't know how to be personal with my children. I only saw myself as, I have to be strict and stern because somebody has to set emotion aside and push these kids to be the best they could be, not knowing that very behavior is almost certainly more detrimental than in any way actually ending to the result you want. I was struggling in feeling adequate at my job. I was struggling to feel adequate as a husband. I was struggling to feel adequate as a son or as a father. I was struggling to feel adequate in all the parts of my world. Mormonism was the one thing I knew I was good at. So why wouldn't I be the bishop? I'm going to be good at that. And the moment I was called, I immediately went and read the church handbook of instruction from page 1 to page N, because that's what I do, is I read books and I find things other people don't. And so I read that book and I said, I'm going to set all of my assumptions that I've watched over the years about how people lead wards, and I'm going to look for loopholes in the book of how to do it different but better. And so I would do things like call a person to be the young men's president when they didn't have the Melchizedek priesthood. I would call the single woman to be the Relief Society president. I would call people into positions that hadn't exactly been done that way before, but the handbook didn't say you couldn't. I looked at what was necessary and I tried to get rid of things that weren't necessary. And I think, again, part of this is arrogant, but part of this is those folks in that ward, even after I've left the church, the folks in the ward have given me feedback that even as you've left and lost your testimony, Bill, you were the best bishop I ever had. I was a good one. Yeah.
And the fact that you're getting emotional shows that maybe some of the biggest, most joyful moments in your life were when you were at the top of your Mormon game, serving as a Mormon bishop.
Things were already starting to get complicated. I could start to sense that something wasn't right here. And I didn't want to lead my ward in an unhealthy way. So when people came to me with problems, I think I was compassionate where other folks before me had imposed the rigidity of the rules and repentance and don't take the sacrament, and where I would just love people and kind of accept them where they were. And I sensed that that was a better way to treat people than the way church leadership had been modeled for me.
So, take us to how you go from becoming a Mormon bishop, really committed, to listening to Mormon Stories podcast as a Mormon bishop. Because I don't think you were the first Mormon bishop to contact me, but you were certainly the first Mormon bishop to really engage me and to say, I'll come on the show. But that shows a journey you had been taking, an intellectual journey that you had been taking that was pretty significant while you're bishop. Because almost no bishops, I can probably count on 3 of the number of active Mormon bishops that have come on Mormon Stories in the past 18 years. And only one has not been aired because they've asked me not to air it. And the other was just on recently, but he didn't use his real name. You are the only one to this day that I can remember that was willing to use your real name as an actively serving bishop who's ever been aired on Mormon Stories. How did you get to that point as a bishop?
So even, I told you earlier about how I read everything. Like that continued all through our marriage. I would go to our library, our city library, and I ran out of books there to read. I'd read them all. So then I started requesting books from other libraries. And every book you read gives you some new insight on Mormonism that you didn't have. It's one of the things too I think the internet has done for Mormonism in terms of being detrimental to it, is that before the internet, you had to read one dirty fact at a time. You had to go find a book and you'd read it and you'd learn some little problem, but it's one problem and it's the first one you've learned in a month, so you put it aside and it's no big deal. And I would constantly request books from other libraries. The library would notify me that they had showed up. I'd go and pick them up. I'd bring them home. I'd read them. I wanted to know everything. And so as the internet is coming online, I'm looking for ways to engage the church, the history of it, the gospel. And so I take my MP3 player and I start downloading talks. And I start with really safe inside stuff. And the first thing I really got hooked onto was Brad Wilcox and Stephen Robinson and Robert Millett as they framed grace in a way that Bruce R. McConkie certainly wasn't doing. And they were framing grace in a way that no leader had really approached. And it was a much softer way of going like, we don't have to be perfect. I don't have to do all I can do. I just have to keep trying. And in the midst of feeling like a failure everywhere other than church, that message resonated because I finally sensed like the ward doesn't know how flawed I am, but maybe I can make it to heaven. Maybe I actually can get there. And so I would listen to these talks over and over. Little by little, I branch out. And you start to sense like, maybe there's things out there that I don't even know exist. And so you start doing searches, Mormon, MP3. And what comes up is various things, but among them is Mormon Stories. And as I go on, and obviously I knew that Mormon expression existed. And as I had given that a shot, listening to it, the bad language immediately told my Mormon radar that was not going to be okay.
And for those who don't know, that's John Larson's podcast that he started around 2009, 2010, during this little hiatus that I had taken from podcasting while I was applying to grad school.
Yeah.
So you'd known about those 2 podcasts.
Yeah. And as I listened to an episode or 2 of Mormon Expression and realized kind of the rough language, I'm sort of looking back now as I'm talking to you, and one of those episodes was not Nephi's transoceanic voyage. But had it been, I think that might have quickened the pace because my logical brain would have seen like, oh my goodness, how absurd that is.
That's the how to build a transatlantic vessel
How Nephi
episode.
built his ship
Yeah.
and how complex and absurd it is that he would have been able to do so with all the resources available that would have been required to tackle such a project.
We'll put a link to the show notes.
Please.
That's probably the most cited Mormon expression.
But that
episode.
wasn't one of them.
Yeah.
And then in the episodes I listened to, it didn't significantly grab at me, and the bad language was a turnoff. So I looked elsewhere, and I found Mormon Stories, and I don't know what it was, but of the early conversations I listened to, it was Richard Bushman coughing through 7 hours of him being sick, but you asking him all the questions I had in my head that no one in the 3-hour block or otherwise inside the church would ever want to approach. I sort of had this naive perspective that everyone in the church was ignorant of these issues because no one talked about them. Mm-hmm. And whenever the missionaries had an investigator whose minister was throwing out problems, or they had an investigator who had a sticky question, the missionaries would always come get me. I was the guy who answered the tough questions. And as I'm sitting there listening to your conversation with Bushman, it was the first moment where I'm listening to a conversation and going, those are the questions I want to have asked. And I want to see what someone who's informed, how they answer them. And Bushman leaves plenty of room for you to go like, yep, it's messy, but it's true. And then the next one I listened to was Terrell Givens. And in the Terrell Givens conversation, I remember Terrell Givens telling you, John, if you just make some allowances. And I thought, yeah, if you just make allowances, that this all works out. In fact, that your conversation with Terrell Givens led to me doing an episode with Mormon Discussion that was titled something along the lines of the True and Living Church, where I run through that conversation and I take all of Terrell Givens' allowances and say the church can still be true if you make room like this.
But that's fast forwarding.
That's fast forwarding. But to show how important that conversation was to me, mm-hmm. I had listened to it several times. At my job, when I went across the ferry, I would take a ferry sometimes and go over to the islands on Lake Erie to measure a new house or to measure a home. And it would give me hours of no one bothering me, where I could just listen to podcasts and MP3 files. And so as I listened to your podcast, I wanted those conversations to happen. And as I listened to the one that really kind of made a difference was when you interviewed Brant Gardner. And you interviewed Brant Gardner. He writes a book, I think it's called The Gift and Power of God. And he writes a book on the translation method of the Book of Mormon. And it's the first time I'm hearing a conversation deal sort of honestly with the seer stone and the hat and the fact that we got one story on the front end with spectacles, but now it's not really that. And as that conversation's taking place, you're, for the first time in my exposure to you, you're being a little harsh with him as I saw it.
Challenging
him.
His apologetic answers.
And I don't want you to challenge him because I want to believe. I want the church to be true. That's the most important thing. I want the information, and I value the truth. But I'm really hoping that you'll make room for it to be true because that's what I want. And your challenging him was abrasive to me because I was really enjoying your podcast. I was 5 episodes in or something, and I picked which ones I wanted to listen to. And as that conversation was happening, I just sensed like I'm going to reach out to this guy and let him know that I would much rather he do this from a neutral position or maybe even a faithful position rather than give Brant Gardner a hard time. And so I emailed you and shared some thoughts with you. And I think your original question was maybe how I got in. Was it how I got into podcasting myself, or was it?
No. I mean, just how does a Mormon bishop end up listening to Mormon Stories? Was the question. You answered that. When
the Mormon bishop wants to know Mormonism better than everyone else, he finds Mormon Stories.
Yeah, and it's happening obviously over the past 18 years. It's become more and more common. we have, to be clear, we have a ton of active Mormon bishops and stake presidents and high counselors who are listening now.
Former 70s.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you were unique in that you wanted to engage.
Because I thought I knew it well enough that I could walk you in circles and end with us having to leave it as a neutral position, essentially, that the evidence for and against Mormonism was equal. Mm-hmm. And hence, John, why can't you make room for it to be neutral?
Yeah. So I thought it'd be fun. I printed out some of our early exchanges. And so Bill and I both have copies of those early exchanges. So what I thought I'd ask Bill to do is to read some of his early emails to me and maybe read the date and what you wrote. And then if you want to, each time you read one, maybe reflect after. But I thought it'd be fun for you to read your first email to me.
Yeah. December 22nd, 2011. John Dehlin, first, I enjoy your podcast much. I appreciate how you straddle the fence of supporting both those who have lost their testimony and those who have one. I am a believer, but have appreciated hearing support for both sides. My favorites have been the interviews with Bushman, Peterson, Givens, and McCraney, the ex-Mormon evangelical. I read No Man Knows My History by Fawn Brody when I investigated the church at the age of 17, so I knew much of the negative before baptism. I agree with you. If the church was more open about these things, that it would keep a large amount of people from leaving as they could deal with these issues one at a time and not feel deceived. I think the church is moving in that direction and will continue to do so. The reason I'm writing is to suggest a podcast episode. I would love to hear an in-depth discussion about the difference between Mormonism in the 1800s and the Mormonism of today, doctrinally, culturally, daily religious life, etc. Thanks for all you do. I also want to say that whether one is a believer or not, I wish all of us would read the Book of Mormon simply for the good it contains. Bill Reel.
And read the quote after.
Where love is, there is no disputation. Where love is, there is no contention. Where love is, there God will be also.
Okay, so thanks for reading that. Before you maybe reflect in terms of deconstructing it, is there any reflection you have just about where you were at the time that you want to share? And now that you read that.
I don't. My recollection with you is I wrote you a message complaining about the Brant Gardner episode, and then you and I had an interview where I was interviewed by you as a sitting bishop. This is all, I don't remember any of this. And as I read it, what comes to mind is that I'm already a bridge builder. There's already empathy there. I'm already making room for both sides. I also, the email is clear that, like, first off, the idea of juxtaposing old Mormonism with today, that wouldn't be interesting to me at all.
No.
So interests change, right?
Yeah.
But also that I think, like, if I can just push you back, you'll give me the content I want, which is space to think the church is true, regardless of what's real or what isn't. Like, let's keep the position being fair on both sides, whether it is or not. Underneath all of this is a person who wants badly for the church to come out on top, who he's hoping with everything inside of him that the information doesn't lead to a different conclusion than that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's like, protect my world.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. And just full disclosure, and you probably know this, like, we had lost our faith back in 2001. So 10 years prior to this email, Margie and I knew the church wasn't true.
Yeah.
But we loved the church like you, and we wanted to carve a way to make it work. So it was an intentional decision on my part to have a strategy of being kind to the church, of being compassionate to the church, and of interviewing all sides, not in a sneaky way to make people ultimately leave, but in a genuine desire to both talk about the real things like you had. Mm-hmm. You wanted to talk about the real things and to get real, but also to find a way to make it work. So you were sort of like acting as like an angel on the one side of my shoulder, saying, "Come on, John, keep up. I need you there." You're like, you're having the conversations I want to have. You're helping me stay.
You're the only person having the conversations I want to have.
Yeah. And so like you really connected at that point.
Yeah.
And this also foreshadows the role you end up playing in Mormonism later when I get excommunicated, right?
Yeah.
But anyway, anything else you want to say about that first email, or we could jump to the second?
The negative side, I would say, is how naive that young Bill Reel was.
Why?
Because you don't know what you don't know. You don't know how much has been withheld from you. You think you know the messy issues, but until you really dive in, you don't realize that your simple solutions don't work. You don't realize that there is an intentional obfuscation inside the church, that you're not really safe or encouraged to investigate these issues. You don't have any idea what the coming years are going to bring and just how hard it's going to be.
That's so powerfully said.
Yeah. You ready for the next one?
Yeah. So the next one's how much later? Because I don't think I responded to that first one. So the second one is February 12th, 2012. So this would be 2 months later. 2 months later, right?
Yeah. 2 months later, February 12th, 2012. John, I read No Man Knows My History as well. You must have written me back.
Maybe. It's probably not everything, but...
You must have written me back. But I wrote, John, I read No Man Knows My History as well. I read it before I was baptized. I joined when 17. Now I'm 33. I knew 90% of the difficult issues most of my time in the church, but have recently become troubled. Not by the issues, but by the church's lack of openness to them. My question is this: while you take the position that the church is not the true church, you also have interviewed folks like Bushman and Givens who still hold their testimony of the church being the true church, and that it is in fact true. Do you see room that, flawed though it may be and not always living up to expectation, that the church is or can still be what it proclaims to be on at least 3 points? The Book of Mormon is a literal record translated from metal plates. Joseph did really see God and angels. This church, while full of deeply flawed humans as leaders, does have authority from God. Thank you, Bill Reel. P.S. I'm a bishop in the church. I love your program. If you are ever interested in talking to a regular Joe Mormon who is aware of the issues and still holds to his testimony, I would love to do that. I think many see Bushman and Givens and see that they have a higher vested interest in staying. I have often struggled with my faith, and yet with my, quote, in my view, unquote, evidence on both sides, I still find myself deciding to believe. Anyway, thanks for caring about Mormons who don't fit the mold. Mormons like me. Yeah.
And at this point, you're telling me you're a bishop, right?
So now it gets interesting. I'm not just one of a lot of people who are reaching out to you. I'm in a position that you haven't had a chance to interact with yet.
And this is my third year of grad school now. So I'm in my third year of a PhD. Yeah. I'm trying to balance, and there's a lot going on in my life in 2012, independently of grad school and Mormon Stories. And so I'm super busy, but you caught my attention when you said you're a bishop who's kind of on the fence.
Yeah.
Any reflections you want to have of this email?
I never saw you as the enemy, and reading this is sort of touching because I can sense my sort of love and appreciation of you. That you're doing the thing that no one else is willing to do, which is ask the questions no one else wants to say. And you get people on who are willing to answer the questions that no one else is willing to say. I I note that I try to reduce the church down to if I can just hang on to these 3 things, then all the other stuff can completely fall on its face. And as I'm reading those 3 things, I'm realizing on the back end how problematic those 3 are too.
And they are?
The Book of Mormon is a literal record translated from metal plates. That Joseph Smith really did see God and angels. And that this church, while full of deeply flawed humans as its leaders, does have authority from God.
So Book of Mormon, Joseph Smith, and authority.
Priesthood authority. Because we all realize if we can just hang on to those 3, maybe, but we don't know.
And you had a special attachment to Bushman and Gibbons.
Yeah.
Kind of who I call them neo-apologists. They're not like Peterson and Midgley, bashing critics who are asking sincere questions. They're thoughtful scholars who find nuanced ways to remain believers, knowing the full history. You clearly had an affinity for me and Mormon Stories at the time and for them.
Them because they were the first voices on the inside telling me I wasn't crazy, that the issues really are messy, admitting that the basic facts that you've stated are true, and giving me a place to still believe.
Was it hard to be a bishop where you're questioning your faith? Do you remember it being difficult?
Yeah, I remember hiding it from everyone. I remember hiding it from Amanda. I remember hiding it from my bishopric. I remember hiding it from the members of the ward. I remember hiding it even from my parents who were non-members, that I always, because my job is to present the gospel as attractive and to be a good member missionary. And so even telling my parents any of that was not even thinkable. And so I can clearly remember not telling anyone. It was my deep, dark secret that I was struggling. When it said in here that I was troubled, and not troubled by the issues themselves, but troubled by the leaders' unwillingness to acknowledge the basic facts. I try to pinpoint the moment in time where I was no longer exactly believing. And I thought it had happened later on as I look back, because memory's tricky, but it becomes clear in my messages to you that I was experiencing significant cognitive dissonance much earlier than I remembered.
Yeah, and I just wonder, how hard is it
To serve as a bishop.
to be having all this stuff at home, financial struggles, young kids, your relationship with your wife, balancing all that, and being a bishop and all that entails, and then starting to question. Do you just remember what that was like for you?
The church keeps you so busy. Mm-hmm. How do you really have time to sit with your thoughts and to process what you're thinking? So as long as I could hear you asking them and them answering in ways that I go like, oh yeah, like if I just make some extra allowances, then I was able to somehow keep it together. And part of it is I love being Mormon. I showed up every Sunday excited. There comes a point later on where Chris Bloxham asked me what I thought of church on Sunday. And I tell him that I think of Sunday like Christmas. And his response on the back end was, you need better Christmases. But for me, Sunday was the pinnacle of my week. I looked forward to it. I couldn't wait to get in early to bishopric meeting. And as long as it wasn't Cleveland Browns season, I didn't mind staying after. These people, I loved them. These are the folks that they had loved me into the church, and now I had a chance to return the favor, and I wanted nothing more than to be the best bishop they'd ever had. So while I obviously was struggling with doubts, the church being not true wasn't an option at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Can I ask you a follow-up question? Once you became a bishop and you're kind of talking about how compassionate, you were as a bishop and really wanting to show softness and compassion to people in the office that came to you and in general. Did that translate to your relationships at home at all? Did that soften your, like, did it extend to your family at home during that time, or were they kind of very different worlds? So compassion for people at church, but still not showing up in your personal relationships.
I'm going to give an answer, but I'd actually like Amanda to comment on this as well, because it was two different worlds. So I think you'd agree that I really was so good to those people. But I didn't bring that to our home. Part of it was we had one daughter who received significant trauma and experiences outside of our home that we were dealing with what looked like, from our point of view in the beginning, was schizophrenia, hallucinations, self-harm. Mm. And she was dealing with things that no human being should have to deal with. But at the same time, she was having what I would call as panic attacks or nervous breakdowns that were threatening the continuity of our home. So there were times that I would have to hold her down so she wouldn't hurt somebody, or so she would, excuse me, so she wouldn't leave and do harm to herself or others. There was one moment in time where she had a knife and she just literally cut herself multiple times with me like 5 feet away, and I had to kind of rush towards her and take it out of her hand. I felt like I had to be this stoic, unemotional person. And because Amanda leans towards emotion, she leans into that. I've always at home tried to say, like, emotion is my enemy. I got to set that aside. I'm going to be logical. I'm going to handle these issues with being stoic and being stern. Who I was to the outside world and who I was to the people I loved most in my home was night and day. And I can't even explain why or how, or it just, like, my empathetic capacity, my compassionate capacity outside of my home, I thought was where a good, healthy human being should be. And yet somehow in my home, I had no ability to access that. And I don't even have words to explain why.
Yeah. So in answer to your question, Margie, no, that didn't translate that way. But also, I just, so many times during this interview, I just so badly want to shout out, but I don't have a bad life. I don't have a bad life. We have a good life. We have, fun. We have good moments. Loud laughter. Always had loud laughter. I didn't listen to that one. And that means for those of not in Mormons, Mormons tell you how loud you can laugh. And, so there was lots of love and lots of those things in our home. I did not have a bad household at all. And so, yeah, I saw the compassion and giving that he gave to them, but I never, I think in the moments I didn't have any negative tag-ons onto that. But I think in the background, though, it kind of came up later of the not choosing me and just things that were kind of detrimental to me personal with the whole self-loathing, whatever. But no, in the times of you being bishop and just, because I also love these people. We wanted each other desperately. And so I also wanted and needed these people. And so the sisters were also my support group. So even though I wasn't getting some of those things from my husband, you did get some of those things from your dear friends, right? And so my cup was still being filled. And so
I think part of that too for you, you and I were aware, as we had friendships with lots of other couples in the ward in the same sort of age group, we were aware of dysfunction elsewhere. And some of that dysfunction looked much worse than what we had in our home. And so maybe there's a degree of kind of counting yourself grateful and thinking that things that aren't great are good because you sense that it could be much worse as patriarchy and arrogance and pride maybe played an even greater part in other homes in our ward.
Mm-hmm. And another thing that you've always done well too is you are a doting person. Love being your love language. You were always very much into giving me that love and touch. And you verbally would say it as well. And, to the tune of, I almost felt guilty, like, I would say analogy of I almost felt like I had to peel you off of me sometimes, but almost hated saying that out loud because of I know women that would just die for that affection and attention, So there was a lot of that, a lot of love at home, and I just don't want this picture to be painted like life was terrible and things were just always hard. They were very lovely, very lovely.
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
The nuance. Things are oftentimes more complicated, right? More varied, more. Yeah. So I get that. What I think is interesting in this for me, Bill, at this point of where you are in your journey, is just that, you've been vulnerable about sharing about your parents.
Yeah.
And talking about the emotional disconnect sometimes you felt, right? In retrospect, right? And then growing up as a teen and actually verbalizing a fear for yourself or a sense of lack around, will I be an emotionally connected parent? And what's so relatable is when, we experience things as children and we can kind of identify, and say, I don't want that. I don't want to do that. Yeah. I want something different. And also, not wanting that sometimes does not, help us. It doesn't mean we have the tools to create something different. It doesn't mean that we find ourselves oftentimes in life, in that place where you're like, and here I am. And, that grappling of, I didn't want it, I feared, or maybe even created a belief that I didn't have it, or I don't know how to give that because I didn't receive it, or whatever the case may be. But that's so relatable is what I'm saying, is to have this sense of awareness hit you of like, and yet here I am,
Yeah. That I was in some real true way doing the best I could. My parents, whenever the conflict would arise, generally my dad would not be doing something my mom was expecting him to do. She would then get really snarky with him, yell at him. He would just go quiet, go to the other section of the house. She would burn off some steam. He'd make a few snide remarks, and they would just move on. They never had any conflict resolution. And I go to church, and it's all pretending and masks. And while they are teaching you the gospel of Jesus Christ, they're not really teaching you how to be a healthy, productive human either. Mm-hmm. And so I don't really have anyone showing me any tools to do any of it.
And and the same, and my parents, they didn't argue. I never saw my parents argue. I've heard my dad go, and it was usually at us kids, like, oh, thanks make me so mad I can eat a bologna sandwich. Or he would say, horse manure. So that kind of became a game of my friends to see what they could have my dad say, but my parents didn't argue. So, yeah, we had zero conflict resolution
modeled
tools.
For us, yeah.
Modeled for us. And so I would get full, I would leave, things would be better for a minute, and...
Yep.
Yeah.
All right. Well, this is a really important background. So So then going back to our email exchange, it's 2012. I'm in my third year of grad school. 7 years into Mormon Stories, I'm imagining I was so busy, I didn't have time to exchange you through email earlier because I'm a slow writer. But then once you mentioned you're a bishop, my response, this was February 13th, 2012. It says, Bill, would you be willing to come on the podcast and tell your story? So it's basically like, I don't have time to engage you in email, but man, if you want to come on the podcast, I'm game. Do you want to read your response?
And this is the June 29th, 2012?
No, this is February 13th. This is
right
yours.
here.
Yeah.
John, I would. I live in Ohio, though. I also am hopeful you might answer the questions I sent, as it interests me if those who have lost faith see it as reasonable that there still might be room again in their soul for it to be true, or they have 100% absolutely made up their mind. By the way, I listened to the entire Denver Snuffer interview, and I find myself finding agreement with many of his stances. Great interview in all caps. Let me know if I can be of any use to you, Bill Reel.
So do you remember like vibing with Denver Snuffer?
I don't. I don't.
And for those who don't know who that is, Denver Snuffer at the time was a Mormon as a stake high counselor who had written these books about having personal visitations from Jesus. And he was becoming really popular within Mormonism for teaching a fundamentalist type of Mormonism, basically saying Joseph and Brigham got it right, or maybe Joseph got it right, and then the church started falling into apostasy. So you can cut out the middleman of the church and just have a direct relationship with Jesus. That's who I interviewed. And by 2012, Denver Snuffer was starting to get on the radar of his stake presidency. And by 2013, Denver Snuffer was excommunicated, which became the first in a wave of excommunications that would extend to your own years later. But but Denver Snuffer was kind of the first domino. So it's weird that as a bishop in 2012, you're not just vibing with John Dehlin and Mormon Stories, you're vibing with Denver Snuffer.
Yeah.
Two eventual apostates from the church's perspective.
Yeah, and I don't remember much of that. I remember, the idea of the book, Passing the Heavenly Gift, knowing that he was making a claim of seeing Christ. I didn't believe him. Like if the church isn't true, there isn't some other guy out there seeing Jesus instead. I sort of intuitively didn't believe that. But some of it seems apparent, again, reading it now, that some of the arguments he made must have felt influential, felt like they had some weight to them. Essentially opened up the idea that he had thoughts on the things the church was getting wrong that I also resonated with.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So that's taken us to February of 2012. And then at some point, but I still, even though you offered to come on Mormon Stories, I still didn't take you up on it for whatever reason. And so then I pulled up just some exchanges mid-year, kind of in June, where I had done a podcast called What Mormon Stories is Trying to Do and How to Keep It Alive. And I'm not sure if I put the podcast up and took it down, that wouldn't surprise me if I did or it didn't do that. But I don't know if you want to go ahead and read the exchange that I think led to us actually doing the interview.
Yeah, and I think when I mentioned this first line, because I start off this email saying, you removed it again, why? And I think I put a comment somewhere and the comment didn't show up and I thought you had deleted it.
Okay.
And maybe you had, I'm assuming, again, I don't know this for sure, but I'm assuming maybe you reached out and said, hey, post it again. And I did, and somehow it didn't show up again. And so I say, John, you removed it again. Why? I realize you can't control what direction you personally go in, as you have to follow your mind and heart. But why not allow the podcast to still walk the line? I don't see your podcast being very successful if it is completely negative, as Mormon Expression is already doing that. I was a listener, and I still check in each week, hoping for something I like, but not since Brant Gardner. Just wish you could find a way to reach both sides. That is when you are at your best. I'm a bishop in Ohio. I'm the bishop in Ohio that you asked if I would do an interview with you, and I replied yes, but I never heard back. I see the issues in Mormonism the way many who like your podcast do, except I also see room to allow the brethren to be human and to make mistakes and to see that God in the end is asking for faith. And he does that best by giving you two relatively equal decisions to go, two relatively equal directions to go in. Anyway, look forward to your reply, Bill.
So by mid-June of 2012, you're basically kind of saying, I'm unhappy with the direction you've taken Mormon Stories.
Yeah.
You're saying, what happened to the old John?
And if
who
you
was
keep it up,
interviewing-
this is going to fall on its face. You're going to fail.
Yeah. And also, like, I miss the old Richard Bushman, Terrell
Yeah.
Givens, Brant Gardner, Denver Snuffer types interviews.
It's like a good suspense movie where 4 or 5 people in the background could have committed the crime. And the movie is best when you are led to believe it could be any of the folks. And then only in the end does the surprising moment happen where it's revealed who committed the murder or the robbery or whatever. And so in my mind, it was, if you can just be neutral and let both positions have weight, that's when your podcast is at its best.
Yeah. And then within a week, I think we did our first interview. So anything you want to say about, that, what you were preaching to me or our eventual interview, whether there was blowback, what it was like to do that interview, whether there was blowback for doing the interview, anything you want to share about any of that?
Let me start off. Something people don't know about me. I don't do well on the telephone. There are certain kinds of communication that are internally severely uncomfortable. RFM will tell you, I hardly ever pick up. I always pick, if I have anything that I can justify as like, hey, I'm busy doing this thing, I will put off answering his call. And then I'll call him a few hours later. Hey, I'll reach out to you in a little bit. And I reach out when I can kind of get my own internal discomfort under control. And now I control the moment that I can handle the conversation. This has always been the way. Whenever I talk to my mom on the telephone, I would get severely anxious and really uncomfortable. Whenever Amanda wanted to talk to me on the phone, I would get really uncomfortable. To go on a podcast with you didn't bother me at all. I remember my mindset at the time. I was begging inside my head that you would sit down and talk to me. And I really thought I could, and to some degree I think I did, present, like Givens and Bushman, a view of Mormonism where people who wanted to believe could hang on, that could acknowledge the issues were messy. So when we finally did the interview, I was excited, wasn't nervous at all. I tell people, if you call me on the phone, that is way more uncomfortable for me than if you told me that I got to speak in front of the Pontiac Silverdome and I've got 10 minutes to prepare something.
Why are you picking the Pontiac Silverdome?
I lived in Cleveland. It's a little ways away from Detroit. Sorry.
Where do the Browns play?
What's that?
Where do the Browns
They change
play?
the name all the time. I think right now it's called Cleveland Brown Stadium.
Okay.
It was First Energy Stadium, and then it was something else. And, the conversation that you and I had, I was proud of. I felt like I handled myself well. When I got done, there wasn't any blowback at all. There were a few people in my stake who had heard it, and they commented positively. They heard it. They were grateful that I tackled that. They thought I handled myself well. There was no negative from that. In fact, it reinforced to me that the church was true because nobody gave me any flack about even having the conversation. What also happened was that in having that conversation with you, I sort of sensed that I could hold my own. And so I rushed out to Walmart and bought a Logitech microphone headset. And within not too long after this, I think about September of 2012, I started my podcast. And my goal was, I want to have the same conversations that John is having, but I want to leave more room that the church is true. And so having the conversation with you was the moment where I thought maybe I could do a podcast and maybe this isn't as hard as I sort of think it is.
Yeah. Okay. So you become a podcasting Mormon bishop. And the reason people might be going, why are you going down memory lane? Why are we digging up this old stuff? Like, for me, there's a really important theme that I want to end up exploring with you before, you guys go home Tuesday or Wednesday, because me first and then you were trying to fill a really important role. Like just 3 years into Mormon Stories, 2 years into Mormon Stories, I created a website called staylds.com.
Which I've read.
And I wrote a manual, how to stay in the church after a crisis of faith. Like I got a lot of flack in those early years by ex-Mormons. They were like, John, the church is a cult. The church is unethical. It's not true. How in the world can you stay? But I loved it so much. I wanted to carve that middle way in the church.
Yeah.
But that got harder and harder for me over time. By 2012, 2013, I'm doing my LGBT research. I'm starting to see all the suicides, the untenable position of the celibacy, mixed orientation marriage, or leave the church, all the suicide epidemics. I'm seeing all these mixed faith marriages that are horrific within Mormonism. I'm seeing all these divorces, and I'm just carrying all this carnage that the Mormon church is wreaking, in people's lives. Mm-hmm. So I love the church. I want to see it succeed. I feel like it had been good in my life. You probably related to that. And I'm carrying something you're probably not seeing. Although as a bishop, you might be seeing it. I'm carrying just all the carnage too. And it's starting to break me where I'm starting to get angry and it's starting to come out on my podcast, which you as a bishop are detecting, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm kind of repeating it a little bit, but you're sort of seeing that crack open where it's like, come on, John, you're not giving me and us the podcast we need. And if you're not going to do it, then maybe I'm going to need to step in and just carry that torch, right?
Yeah. There's another moment in that podcast which is crucial to moving forward. There's a moment where you push back on me and I'm trying to hold the church's view, which I sort of intuitively grasp isn't coherent in terms of LGBT folks. And you posed the question to me, which was the first time I had to put my own kind of boots on the ground, rubber meets the road. How am I going to confront this issue personally? Because I didn't have this issue in my ward at all as a bishop. I really wasn't aware up to this point of anyone having a faith crisis. In our stake, we had one guy in our ward who left over historical issues. And as far as I knew, I didn't know of anyone else in the stake who had that. So for me, no one is leaving. No one really discovers the church isn't true and takes off. We all know of investigators who get baptized and 3 weeks later they don't attend anymore because it just wasn't interesting. But I didn't know anybody who had encountered the problems. And so I thought in some way like I'm the only person. Like there's this other guy, but he left a few years ago and I'm the only person who seems to recognize that something here isn't right. And so as you and I were having that conversation, you said, Bill, if everything was reversed, let's say heterosexuality was the thing that's not allowed and gay was normal. Bill, could you not act on your inclinations? And I haven't gone back and listened to that, but I remember in my head knowing clearly, no, like I'm a sexual being. I'm a human who has feelings. There's no way I could live a life where even if I thought my religion was true, that I could abstain from intimate relationships with someone I care about. And so in that moment, I recognized that something is wrong about what we ask of people to do because I was clear that I couldn't do it myself. And I don't remember how I answered you, but internally, you in one question had moved me. Often whenever we change our mind or we make adjustments, it's often after layers and layers of things happening. But I could in that very moment sense that I had gone from thinking one thing to thinking something else like that.
Yeah. And I'm going back. This is episodes 363 and 364 of Mormon Stories. And I wrote in the description, We discuss in depth his calling as bishop, including his job to counsel youth and women on sexual matters, masturbation, and homosexuality. And I don't think I tried to really push you too hard, but I did try and talk about the important stuff.
I enjoyed the conversation thoroughly.
Yeah. And you also discussed the future direction of Mormon Stories, because we should go back and listen to that, maybe react to it at some point. Wouldn't that be fun?
Yeah, it would be a great time.
It'd be fun. Maybe let's plan a Mormon Discussions where we...
Let's do it.
Or Mormonism Live, where we respond to that earlier.
It would be fun.
Anyway, so what happened after you bought the microphone, and then what?
So I started, and I went on to Podbean as a platform because it was such a low cost to get started. It was really cheap. And, Mormon expression, kind of the word Mormon with some verb around dialogue, and I knew there was the discussion board called Mormon Dialogues. You had Mormon Dialogue, Mormon Expression, Mormon Stories. I knew I had to use the word Mormon, and I knew I had to get a word that conveyed the gist of what was going on. And so I said, let's go with Mormon Discussion. So I created the podcast Mormon Discussion, started with the cheap microphone, and the first 4 or 5 episodes were me just talking about Brad Wilcox and Robert Millett and Stephen Robinson and the doctrine of Christ and how grace works and how the church doesn't emphasize it, but there's a way to be softer to people. And by episode maybe 3 or 4, this person named Britt Hartley reaches out to me and says, hey, I found your podcast and I'm really enjoying it. And another guy by the name of, I won't say his last name, but a guy by the name of John, lives here in Salt Lake City, reached out and said he was really enjoying the podcast early on. He ended up doing some advertising with us when we were really early, before we were a nonprofit, Costa Rica Travel Pass. And it didn't take long before I started reaching out. And in those early days, part of me was in awe of you getting all of these incredible guests, these authors and scholars and intellectuals in Mormonism. And so I thought, I'll just start reaching out to them. And
what was your goal? Like, we've already kind of talked around it. What was your goal? What was your vision? What was your mission? Maybe I wasn't doing a perfect job, but I was still trying to do the same job I had always done. Why did you feel like there was a need, and what was your vision for how it could be and how it could play out for you and for the podcast and for the church, frankly?
The overlaying goal of the podcast was to help people not feel crazy, that these were real issues, and to offer people a conversation around them when no one else was having it besides you, and to do so in a way that came off more faithful, because I really did want people to stay in the church on the front end of the podcast. Now, there's also an underlying motive that doesn't show through unless you kind of follow episode to episode. But there are moments where you can sense, for instance, I did an episode on how the church proclaims that Jesus was born on April 6th. And Elder Bednar had just recently in conference reiterated that teaching. And I wrote Elder Holland telling him that, because let me back up. We at some point we need to have a conversation about my conversations with Elder Holland and Elder Jensen.
That'll be in part 2.
But in my reaching out to Elder Holland, I told him, because we had already built some rapport, I told him that Elder Bednar was off base. I shared with him the URL links of scholars within the church who were saying that the teaching that Jesus Christ was born on April 6th was nonsense, and giving the historical context for how that rumor got started. And I can remember my mindset of that episode. The underlying motive was to force these leaders to confront their own history and to start being honest about it.
So you were wanting to hold the brethren's feet to the fire a little bit.
Yeah, and I don't remember, but now reading the emails, you can see that's also something that's bothering me as I'm reaching out to you. Is not the issues themselves aren't making me want to. I'm not feeling cognitive dissonance by the issues. I'm feeling cognitive dissonance because everyone's ignoring the issues, and it feels intentional.
Yeah.
And I'm going to press these guys to start being honest about this.
Yeah. Okay. But your ultimate goal was to see the church become more open and transparent, talk about the problems.
Make it all softer on those of us who were discovering this mess, and to allow people without feeling deceived by their leaders to be able to stay and believe.
Okay. All right. So as you start having these interviews and did you immediately start having interviews, or was it monologues for a while?
It was monologues for probably the first 15 episodes or so.
Okay.
Maybe a little less. And I really enjoyed that because I felt like I knew things about the church that were beyond kind of the standard of what the average Mormon knows. And so I could talk about things that were new and refreshing to some people anyway. But before long, I don't know who my first interview was with, but I know Brad Wilcox was pretty early on. And I had a great
Brad Wilcox?
The Brad Wilcox.
What? You got Brad Wilcox on Mormon Discussion?
I interviewed him for a 2 or 3 part series, yeah. And we talked about grace and playing the piano and how it's all practice. And and I remember asking him, like, why don't the church leaders frame grace this way? I don't remember what his response was, but just noting that here's this guy in the church who seems to have more love and a more inclusive understanding of the gospel than the very leaders themselves have.
If somebody wants to go just see your Mormon Discussion episodes in chronological order, is there a way to do that?
Yep. So if you go to mormondiscussionpodcast.org, on the header, there's a button that says archive. And if you hit archive and then scroll all the way to the bottom, because the most recent are at the top.
But are all the other podcasts in your network interwoven into those as well?
Yeah. So you can also go to MD, standing for Mormon Discussion, mdpodcast.org.
No, it's okay. All right. So I'm looking through those early, and like people are rediscovering Mormon Expression podcast. I want them to rediscover.
By the way, if you're a believer, I think my early episodes on the doctrine of Christ and grace and the interviews with Brad and my interviews with other scholars and intellectuals and authors early on, like you, I think leaves plenty of room for people to recognize they're not alone while still having room to kind of believe in the church.
Okay, so I'm looking through, and you've got, these Doctrine of Christ episodes early on, the Holy Ghost. You got Brian Whitney. I know Brian. You got Brian Whitney really early on. He was a kind of a historian that was working for the church history department.
Yeah, and I went to the church history department and spent an afternoon with Amanda. We met Stephen Harper and Mark Ashurst McGee and shook hands and rubbed shoulders.
That's stuff I never got to really do.
Yeah.
So that's innovation on your part very early on.
Yeah.
That's cool. So you have Richard Bushman, episode 19?
I think I'm talking about something Bushman said, but I'm not interviewing him that early. But I did interview him twice.
Yeah. Yeah, eventually. Yeah. Okay, so there's Brad Wilcox. You got Michael Ash, Shaken Faith Syndrome. Yeah. He's a character.
The other thing, too, is not too long after I start the podcast, a few months in, Steve Densley from FAIRMormon reaches out to me and says that FAIRMormon folks are really liking what I'm putting out.
Yeah, because by episode 37, you've got Brian Hales in there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Keep going.
Just that FAIRMormon reached out and asked if I would duplicate my work with them. And I don't know that they maybe expressed it that way, but I said, hey, I'm happy to put things out on your platform. I don't have the time in the day to do both platforms uniquely. So I'm happy to produce things for Mormon Discussion and then also publish them with a different intro and outro and a different introduction as part of FAIRMormon.
And that must have felt super validating to have. And for those who don't know, FAIRMormon to this day is the church's apologetic, unofficial but official apologetic organization.
Strangely, at every year at their conference, a general authority speaks.
Yeah. But it must have felt incredibly validating to have them reach out to you and want to collaborate.
Yeah. And I think we did so there's 2 problems, or at least 2 points that need to be made. One is that in 2013, it's the last year they won the podcast awards. And if you watch the award ceremony in Las Vegas in 2013, the representative for FAIRMormon steps up to the microphone and starts off his thankful speech for accepting the reward and thanks first and foremost Bill Reel, and then names Ned Scarsbrick and other members of the podcast. But because 90% of what they put out that year was my work. The other thing people don't know is the reason they won. So I like saying I won. It feels good, right? But I also know it's not legitimate because FAIRMormon is a large organization of volunteers, and behind the scenes when the voting happened, they would encourage their volunteers to vote as many times as they possibly could. So every member of FAIRMormon is going to the site and voting for FAIRMormon, their podcast, 50 times, 100 times, 200 times. And that is something that no other podcast in that category would have had. In other words, every other podcast has its listeners, but it doesn't have a staff of hundreds. And so FAIRMormon had sort of a loophole that allowed them to cheat the system and have their podcast win.
Yeah. And so what was that important to you? Like what are your reflections on that?
Just that they really didn't win.
Yeah.
There were other podcasts there that were better.
Yeah.
Even as I'm the one that's really creating the work, there were other podcasts that were better.
Yeah.
That had a larger following.
They kind of stacked the deck.
They stacked the deck.
Yeah. So as I'm scrolling through those early episodes, I mean, you've got a lot of these people are still the big names in Mormon apologetics. You've got Patrick Mason, Terrell Givens, Jennifer Finlayson Fife. And
you probably noticed this, but you would interview these folks and then I would grab them next because I didn't even know they existed until you interviewed them.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so what was that like? Mormon Stories was still going. I was still in the church. And then your podcast really starts to come on the scene. How did you think about your relationship to Mormon Stories, to me, to FAIRMormon? I was critical of FAIRMormon during that time. I never really liked the apologists ever.
Yeah.
So as you start to like not only have your podcast gain popularity, FAIRMormon embraces you, and then you start interviewing the big names and even interviewing more big names than I was able to get, because by this point in Mormon Stories,
they won't say yes to you.
They won't come on anymore because I was willing to interview Grant Palmer. I was willing to interview, real critics of the church.
They'll
Michael
talk to you
Quinn.
as long as you play nice.
Yeah. Yeah. Like that was the thing is FAIRMormon liked me too until I interviewed Grant Palmer, which was, but for me, I only was interested in doing it, Mormon Stories, if I could interview both sides. To this day, I only want to do it if I can interview both sides. So so you kind of were able to get in there in that middle ground that I just wasn't able to walk, honestly, partly for just a matter of conscience. I wasn't going to, they would come to me and say, if you want to keep in our good graces, don't interview Grant Palmer, don't interview Michael Quinn, because you're giving a platform or a voice to apostates. So you were able to get in there, which, I don't think I ever was upset or unhappy that you were doing what you're doing. In fact, I think there was a part of me that felt relieved. It's like, I can't fully do what is needed to keep that middle ground. I'll keep trying, but I can't fully do it in a way that's going to keep people happy. So I think in my mind, I was like, well, this feels a little bit competitive, but I'm still glad Bill's able to do it. You know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
How did you feel?
So you can tell by the early emails to you that I respect you and I'm appreciative of what you're doing. As I began to work with FAIRMormon, there was a moment, I don't remember what it was, but there was something that you said in a discussion board or somewhere that at the time I thought the point that you made was faulty. And I pushed back, and immediately 10 guys from FAIRMormon write me and go, man, way to give it to him. Way to give it to that John Dehlin. And so I was like, oh, thanks, whatever. But it wasn't about you personally. It was about something you said in regards to like a truth claim or a historical point. And I pushed back. And FAIRMormon saw me as standing up for them and knocking you down. What they didn't know was that I also don't have any tolerance for ad hominem and making it personal and tearing people down when it's unnecessary, right? So immediately in the coming weeks, they are attacking you on a personal level behind the scenes in their volunteer forum, their emails that go back and forth. And I think this is right around the time that Greg Smith is beginning to kind of plan this rebuttal to you that's going to be very much attacking you personally. And so behind the scenes, FAIRMormon is having these conversations where they are hitting you at a personal level. But what they don't know is even though they saw me as pushing back against you on a data point, that I wasn't okay with the way they were doing that. And so me and a few other folks, John Westover was another one that was in FAIRMormon at the time who had what I would call a higher degree of ethics than what most of FAIRMormon has. And so John and I think maybe one other person reached out to all of these folks as this conversation was happening and said, we don't get this. We totally get you disputing with Mormon Stories or John Dehlin on the data. If he's getting a historical fact wrong, let's give a counter argument. But we don't get why you're beginning to articulate going after him on a personal level. And so when I did that is kind of the beginning of the end, because now the folks at FAIRMormon are writing me off to the side, having a one-on-one email exchange and going, yeah, some of our volunteers don't really like that you're standing up for John Dehlin. They don't really like that you're telling them that they're wrong. And their excuse would be, John Dehlin's work has hurt these people. They've lost siblings who have left the church. They've lost a kid or a parent who's left the church. And so you have to understand how angry they are. And so they should be allowed to be personal and attack John Dehlin. And that didn't make any sense to me. And so at that point, I'm starting to sense that apologetics, they don't really care about the means as long as we get to the end. And I don't work that way. And so it essentially was now on the road out in terms of FAIRMormon sensing that maybe I'm also the enemy.
Yeah, so my sister at some point was involved in FAIRMormon, my sister Julianne, and
yeah, at the same time.
Yeah.
By the way, I was aware of that.
Right.
I saw her in that as well. Nothing negative, just I was aware that she was in FAIRMormon at the same time I'm in FAIRMormon.
Yeah, so I knew that you and FAIRMormon had a falling out, and at some point it kind of even spilled over into the public, but I never really understood what that falling out was. It sounds like some of that was your objection to the ad hominem. Anything else you want to say about your falling out with FAIRMormon?
Yep. So it was also that when someone would write to FAIRMormon and say, I have a question, there would then be this discussion behind the scenes of all the volunteers on how that question gets answered. And no matter who answered it, and no matter how weak that answer was, like us as volunteers knew that there was a better argument made by the critic that would then water down this answer given that solves the problem. And as I would go like, hey, you guys, like these answers aren't that great. Like this isn't the right answer. We know this or we know that. They didn't want that. In their world, no matter how weak the faithful resolution is the only answer it's allowed to be given. So if you tried to take the conversation to acknowledging that the critic has on any level a valid argument and that maybe the apologetics don't actually resolve the problem, they saw that as that's a no-no. You can't do that. And so as I and John Westover and maybe another person or two would kind of put some resistance to that and say like, whoa, like you guys are saying this solves that, but shouldn't you share with them this that President Kimball said, or that also acknowledges that this problem is more complicated? And at that point, when you suggest that, again, you get reached out to individually off to the side by Steve Densley and John Lynch, by to a lesser extent President Scott Gordon, and you get told, that's not how we do things here.
So no concessions, basically.
No concessions. And there's this really neat moment that happens where John Westover, I, and again, another person or two perhaps, we suggest to them that they ought to create a discussion board where people can come with their questions and we will answer them with empathy, sort of like Givens or Bushman does. And they took our...
kind of the pastoral... what ends up becoming called neo-apologetics.
Yep.
You start advocating for pastoral,
Yep.
non-ad hominem,
Yep.
not give bad answers,
Yep.
but give empathetic,
Acknowledge
validating,
it. This is a better way to treat people. And FAIRMormon actually takes the idea and does it. And so they created a discussion board where we were allowed in the conversation to validate the concerns and to some degree honor that the critic has a real question and that there's a real problem here and we need to speak to it more honestly. And that discussion board lasted like 2 months and they pulled it because immediately they sensed that doing that actually worked counter to what their goal is, which really isn't to help faith crises at all, but is to protect the good name of the church.
Which kind of goes back to some of your early emails to me, because you're like, if we could just have these conversations, it'll
Everything will
help
be
people
great.
stay and
Yeah.
it'll protect
No.
faith. You were experimenting on that.
Yeah.
And they were saying that's not the way.
Yeah.
But you were still optimistic. I don't know if naive is the right word, but you were still optimistic that candid conversations could do more good things for active LDS members' faith than take faith away.
And maybe even unsaid, but it would relieve the hurt and harm that people were experiencing as their concerns were being dismissed.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So the way I kind of want to end part one is with you kind of what ends your time as bishop.
Yeah.
And, you know, what is the end that kind of marks maybe the sneak peek into part two where your faith starts to unravel? So maybe take us to your being released as bishop and to that moment where you start to realize you've reached the apex of your optimism of what sort of progressive faithful Mormonism is. What's the very first moment where you're like, ooh, I don't know whether all this can be reconciled like I thought. Maybe there's a man behind the curtain. You know that kind of moment?
Yeah.
Can you take us to that point?
Yeah.
And then we'll break and then come back for part two.
Sweet. So I am a sitting bishop. The gospel topic essays, the first two had come out. Race and Priesthood, I think, is one of them. Maybe Are You Christian is one of the others. And then I think there was a third one sometime around 2013 that comes out. I'm a sitting bishop, and I've got 4 years in, 4.5 years in, somewhere in that range. I've begun collecting quotes by Bushman and Givens that talk about how we need to deal with people in faith crisis more softly. I'm telling my stake presidency that this is a significant issue, that there are lots of folks right now who are discovering that the church wasn't honest or truthful or forthright about its problems. I'm asking them if I can have conversations with them about the problem. On the front end, they're eager to have the conversation. I would present in a stake meeting or at times one-on-one with the stake presidency. I would present to them the problem, what scholars are saying, what this means about how we have to shift, about how we handle it. And you could just feel it being dismissed. Like, hey, thanks for your time. We won't do anything with that. And there was even meetings where the state clerk, his name was Roger, I forget the last name, but Roger, where Roger, as the state clerk, would even go to the stake presidency while I'm sitting there explaining it and go, Bill's right. Bill's right. These are real issues. Like, he was smart enough and informed enough, still believing, but knew that there was messiness that the rest of the people in the room didn't know. And so on the front end, it felt like they really sincerely wanted to at least be aware. But as soon as the information's presented, they wanted to distance themselves from it entirely, and they would do nothing with it.
Yeah, it's one thing to have this subculture removed from active church discourse where we can all try and help each other and make things work for the people on the fringes. But bringing that discourse into church conversations, ward and stake leadership is a totally another level that until Givens and Bushman are forced to, and Mason are forced to do the tours, you know what I mean? It's still very early for activists to try and be promoting open, honest, genuine discourse about problematic history.
Yeah.
And you kind of, it sounds like you ran into that.
Yeah. And then there was a second thing that happened that in some ways was completely unrelated. And it's this idea that as I'm sitting as a sitting bishop, I'm getting experience with leaders higher up. And there's one guy in particular, he was our bishop in our ward. And he just had this arrogance to him. Whenever we would clean up after an activity, he would stand around while everybody else carried chairs every time. He never did his home teaching in a 10-year period. But he's in the stake presidency, and he is shaming everyone else in a priesthood meeting about how they need to do their home teaching. And I'm starting to sense there's a disconnect between what we claim is happening in terms of callings and who's called and righteousness, and how easy it is for people to put on the facade of saying the right things to get into leadership, but clearly not having the qualities of a human being who can be compassionate and empathetic towards people. And you can see how manipulation can get you into leadership. And then there's a third data point, which is as I'm going out and doing my own home teaching, I have members that I home teach who are sharing with me their patriarchal blessing. And two in particular, as they read their blessing to me, I want to read my blessing to you, Bishop. I want to read it to you. Okay, please. They read it. And I notice that it sounds identical to mine. And I go home and get mine out, and I'm right. And so I go to the stake presidency. I actually talked to the current patriarch first, who used to be our stake president. Nicest guy in the world. And he validates me and goes, hey, just so you know, that patriarch who was before him, that patriarch had dementia the last few years of his life. And Bishop, it seems reasonable that you should be able to ask to have your patriarchal blessing re-given. So I took this former stake president, this loving man who's kind, who gave me what felt like empathetic, validating perspective. And I go to the current stake presidency, which is the guy who's in the stake president who used to be our bishop, who's unhealthy. And I pose the problem to him, and I tell him what the former stake president, current patriarch said. And he looked at me and said, no way. I won't even go ask.
And you were a bishop?
I was bishop. And I sensed that doing the right thing isn't always a motivating factor. And those three things sort of came to a head at the same time. And I no longer was going to automatically give the benefit of the doubt to the church.
And were you released soon thereafter? Or?
I had asked the stake president, I told the stake president that I was burned out. They knew I had doubts because I was sharing all this information with them and saying, hey, like me, other people are having doubts. We ought to handle these better. I said, I can't manage my own faith crisis and help all of these ward members. I don't have enough time to sit and process what I'm going through. Please find the next guy. He said, okay, I hear you. I'll do it. Give me some time. Obviously, that process takes a while, right? They have to send a name to Salt Lake, and they got to pray about all that stuff. Several months goes by. 3 months, 6 months, something. And I'm realizing I'm just still the bishop. I'm having a faith crisis. They know it. I've told them I'm burned out, and it's almost like, he'll be fine. And so I reach back out to him and I say, I came to you months ago. I told you I'm burned out. You asked me for some time, but how much time? Like, let's figure this out. And then it was about 2 to 3 months later. So I must have been 3.5 years in or something at that point. But 2 to 3 months later, finally, they had extended a call to the new bishop, and I was told that in a couple of weeks I would be released.
And around what month and year was that where you were no longer bishop?
2014, somewhere.
Okay.
Late 2013, early 2014.
And you would say you were in full-blown faith crisis by the time you were released as bishop?
By 2013, when the first 2 or 3 gospel topic essays come out, I was a sitting bishop, and I was intentionally trying to have members of my ward give their sacrament talks on the gospel topic essay because I wanted everyone in that ward to confront the fact that there is a mess here and we're going to have to deal with it.
It's like, hey, I left Fowler stage 3 into stage 4, and you're all coming with me.
Yeah, yeah,
And
totally.
that's not.
It doesn't work anyway.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. Okay, so you were released, and I'll just ask, what was it like for both of you to be released? What was it like for both of you to have Bill be released? Bill, what was it like for you?
I felt like I had been a really good bishop, and I think the members of the ward would have agreed. And I was happy with how I had served, and I was aware that my beliefs having shifted, that I needed to move on anyway.
But it's a position of power and notoriety.
Yeah,
and
that didn't
it's probably
bother me.
validating.
Yeah, but I don't think that part of it ever bothered me at all.
Okay.
My next calling was I was the ward mission leader. And we can pick up in the next episode with that because that'll be interesting. But I was grateful to no longer be the bishop.
And Amanda, did you know by the end of his time as bishop, he was in full-blown faith crisis mode? And how did you feel about him being released?
Yeah, I think by this time he told me, because it was probably going into the Mormon Stories interview, you know, that this is now starting to, like, he has to talk to his wife now, right? Like, he cannot contain this, you know? But yeah, being released, it was just the next part in the journey. And although, yes, it was an esteemed, powerful, you know, position. And even though, like, he aspired to be that, but also I don't think he did. Like, yes, the power is nice, but also I don't think you dealt in that. No. So, like, to us, it was never like a demotion or, you know, any of those things. I just think it was just naturally the next stepping stone, and you know, and I can now visibly see the stress of being a father to the ward and trying to do that well, while also trying to figure himself out and be true to himself. You know, and seeing all that tension, it was just a tension release at that point. Mm-hmm.
What about just getting your husband back?
You know, a little funny side note about that is the kids. Like, you know, being the bishop's wife, 4 young children, like, I have got this strategically now who's going to go to be quiet. The bishop's kids are not going to be the problem during sacrament meeting, right? And my children have only known their dad to be on the stand, right? Because you got a couple years as the counselor,
3 years
and now
in the bishopric,
3.5 years in the bishop.
4.5 years as the bishop.
So, like, that's all they know is dad on the stand. So now dad's back here with us, and they can't go anywhere. And, like, they were not happy to have their
here,
dad.
We're going to be reverent
with them, because it kind of interrupted our whole church going routine. But so that was just kind of a funny side note with the kids.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think this concludes part one of our interview with Bill and Amanda Reel, the making of Bishop Bill Reel. And that's kind of a cliffhanger for part 2, which is going to be the unmaking of Bishop Bill Reel, and where your Mormon discussion journey took you that ultimately led in your excommunication. And that's going to be part 2. Margie's favorite part of Mormon Stories interviews, where I'm just being silly with you, where we talk about your full deconstruction and unraveling.
Yeah.
And and what took you from Mormon bishop to no longer believing, maybe some of your interactions with Jeffrey Holland and other apostles.
Marlon Jensen, church historian.
We'll be talking about that maybe.
Yep,
and
I'd
then
love to.
Your ultimate excommunication, which I attended.
Yeah, and played a vital role.
And then part 3 will be rebuilding kind of after your excommunication.
Love it.
Does that sound right?
I'm excited.
All right.
Can't wait to see where it goes.
Well, thanks for doing a 3-hour part 1, Bill.
Awesome. Thank you, my friend.
And Amanda, thanks for being here.
Thank you so much.
And Margie, so great to have you.
So great to be here.
And don't go away. Come right back for part 2 of our interview with Bill and Amanda Reel, where we'll talk about what led to Bill leaving the church. Take care, everyone. And thanks for your support on Mormon Stories podcast. Also, check out Radio Free Mormon podcast, Mormonism Live podcast, and Mormon Discussion podcast. Go back into the archives, especially if you're a faithful, believing Mormon. There's a lot there that might keep you in the church.
Yeah, it's a fun journey to watch.
All right. See you guys soon, everybody. Thanks for joining us on Mormon Stories.